Section 31 of the Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Curry. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands, corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Of Curiosity, or an overbusy inquisitiveness into things impertinent. Part 1. If a dwelling house, by reason of its ill situation or contrivance, be not commodiously light and airy, or too much exposed to ill weather and unhealthy, it is most advisable entirely to quit such a habitation, unless perhaps through continuance of time, neighborhood of friends, or any other endearing circumstance, a man should become much wedded to the place. In which case it may be possible, by the alteration of windows and new placing of doors and staircases, either to remove or to lessen these inconveniences. By such like remedies, even whole cities have been much amended and improved both as to health and pleasantness. And it is said of the place of my nativity particularly, that while it once lay open to the western winds, and to the beams of the declining sun streaming over the top of Parnassus, it was by Chaeron turned toward the east. But it is thought that Empedocles the naturalist secured that whole region round about from the pestilence by closing up the rift of a certain mountain, from whence a contagious southerly damp breathed forth upon the flat of that country. And now, since there are several noxious qualities and distempered passions that lurk within the body too, which is the more immediate habitation of the soul, and which, like the dark and tempestuous weather that is without, do cloud and disturb it. Therefore, the like method which has been observed in curing the defects and annoyances of an ill-contrived and unhealthy dwelling may be followed here, in rendering the body a more commodious, serviceable, and delightful mansion for the soul, wherein that it may enjoy its desired calmness and serenity, it will conduce beyond all other expedients whatsoever, that those blind, tumultuous, and extravagant passions should be expelled or extinguished utterly, or, if that cannot be, yet that they be so far reduced and moderated, and so prudently applied and accommodated to their proper objects, that the mischief and disorder of them at least may be removed. Among these may deservedly be accounted that sort of curiosity which, by its studious prying into the evils of mankind, seems to be a distemper of envy and ill nature. Why, envious wretch, with such a piercing ray, blind to thine own, dost others' faults survey? If the knowledge of ill can reward the industrious search with so much delight and pleasure, turn the point of thy curiosity upon thyself and thine own affairs, and thou shalt within doors find matter enough for the most laborious inquiries, plentiful as water in a Leso's stream or leaves about the oak. So vast a heap of offences shalt thou find in thy own conversation, such variety of perturbations in thy soul, and manifold failures in thy duty. To take a distinct and orderly survey of all which, that of Xenophon will be good direction, who said, that it was the manner of discreet housekeepers to place their weapons of war, utensils for the kitchen, instruments of husbandry, and furniture for religious and sacred services, each in several and proper repositories. So every man that would make an exact inquiry into and take a just account of himself should first make a particular search into the several mischiefs that proceed from each passion within him, whether it be envy or jealousy, covetousness or cowardice, or any other vicious inclination, and then distribute and range them all, as it were, into distinct apartments. This done, make thy reviews upon them with the most accurate inspection, so that nothing may divert thee from the severest scrutiny. Obstruct every prospect that looks towards thy neighbor's quarters, and close up all those avenues which may lead thee to any foreign curiosity. Become an eavesdropper to thine own house, listen to the whispers of thine own walls, and observe those secret arts of the female closet, the close intrigues of the parlor, and the treacherous practices of thy servants, which thy own windows will discover to thee. Here this inquisitive and busy disposition may find an employment that will be of use and advantage, and is neither ill-natured nor impertinent, while every man shall call himself to this strict examination. Where have I erred? What have I said or done? What duty, when, and how have I foregone? But now, as the poets feign concerning Lamia, that upon her going to bed she lays aside her eyes among the attirements of her dressing-box, and is at home for the most part blind and drowsy too, and puts on her eyes only when she goes abroad a-gadding. So it is with most men who, through a kind of an affected ignorance and artificial blindness, commonly blunder and stumble at their own threshold, are the greatest strangers to their own personal defects, and of all others least familiarly acquainted with their own domestic ills and follies. But when they look abroad, their sight is sharpened with all the watchful and laborious curiosity imaginable, which serves as deforming spectacles to an evil eye that is already envenomed by the malignity of a worse nature. And hence it is that a person of this busy, meddlesome disposition is a greater friend to them he hates than to himself. For overlooking his own concerns, through his being so heedfully intent on those of other men, he reproves and exposes their miscarriages, admonishes them of the errors and follies they ought to correct, and affrights them into greater caution for the future, so that not only the careless and unwary, but even the more sober and prudent persons may gain no small advantage from the impertinence and ill nature of inquisitive people. It was a remarkable instance of the prudence of Ulysses, that going into the regions of departed souls, he would not exchange so much as one word with his mother there till he had first obtained an answer from the oracle, and dispatched the business he came about. And then, turning to her, he afforded some small time for a few impertinent questions about the other women upon the place, asking which was Tyro, and which the fair Chloris, and concerning the unfortunate Epicasta, why, noosed to a lofty beam, she would suspended die. But we, through extreme sloth and ignorance, being stupidly careless of our own affairs, must be idly spending our time and talk either about our neighbor's pedigree, how that such a one had a tapster for his grandfather, and that his grandmother was a laundress, or that another owes 3 or 4 talents and is not able to pay the interest. Nay, and such trivial stuff as this we busy ourselves about, where such a man's wife has been all this while, and what it was that this and the other fellow have been talking of in a corner. But the wise Socrates employed his curiosity to better purpose, when he went about inquiring by what excellent precepts Pythagoras obtained so great authority among his followers. And Aristippus, meeting Ischomachus at the Olympic games, asked him what those notions were with which Socrates had so powerfully charmed the minds of his young scholars. Upon the slight information whereof, he was so passionately inflamed with a desire of going to Athens, that he grew pale and lean, and almost languished till he came to drink of the fountain itself, and had been acquainted with the person of Socrates, and more fully learned that philosophy of his, the design of which was to teach men how to discover their own ills and apply proper remedies to them. But to some sort of men, their own life and actions would appear the most unpleasant spectacle in the world, and therefore they fly from the light of their conscience, and cannot bear the torture of one reflecting thought upon themselves. For when the soul, being once defiled with all manner of wickedness, is scared at its own hideous deformity, it endeavors to run from itself, and, ranging here and there, it pampers its own malignity with malicious speculations on the ills of others. It is observed of the hen that, loathing the plenty of meat that is cast before her on a clean floor, she will be scratching in a hole or spurning the dunghill in search of one single musty grain. So these overbusy people, neglecting such obvious and common things into which any man may inquire and talk of without offense, cannot be satisfied unless they rake into the private and concealed evils of every family in the neighborhood. It was smartly said by the Egyptian, who, being asked what it was he carried so closely, replied, "It was therefore covered that it might be secret," which answer will serve to check the curiosity of those impertinent men, who will be always peeping into the privacies of others. For assuredly there is nothing usually more concealed than what is too foul to be seen, nor would it be kept so close, were it either fit or safe it should be known. Without knocking at the door it is great rudeness to enter another's house, and therefore in former times were rappers fitted to the gates, that by the noise thereof notice might be given to the family. For the same purpose are porters appointed now, lest, a stranger coming in unawares, the mistress or daughter of the family might be surprised busy or undressed, or a servant be seen under correction, or the maids be overheard in the heat of their scolding. But a person of this prying, busy temper, who would disdain the being invited to a sober and well-governed house, will yet even forcibly intrude himself as a spy into the indecencies of private families. And he pries into those very things which locks, bolts, and doors were intended to secure from common view, for no other end but to discover them to all the world. Aristo said that those winds were the most troublesome which blew up one's garments and exposed one's nakedness. But these inquisitive people deprive us of all the shelter or security of walls and doors, and like the wanton air which pervades the veil and steals through the closest guards of virgin modesty, they insinuate into those divertissements which are hidden in the retirements of the night, and strip men even to their very skin. So that, as it is merrily said by the comedian concerning Cleon, that his hands were in Aetolia and his soul in Thief Town, the hands and feet, eyes and thoughts of inquisitive persons are straggling about in many places at once. Neither the mansions of the great, nor the cottages of the poor, nor the privy chambers of princes, nor the recesses of the nuptial alcove, can escape the search of their curiosity. They are familiar to the affairs of strangers, and will be prying into the darkest mysteries of state, although it be to the manifest peril of their being ruined by it. For as to him that will be curiously examining the virtues of medicinal herbs, the unwary taste of a venomous plant conveys a deleterious impression upon the brain before its noxious quality can be discerned by the palate. So they that boldly pry into the ills of great persons usually meet with their own destruction, sooner than they can discover the dangerous secret they inquire after. And so it happens that, when the rashly curious eye, not contented to expatiate in the free and boundless region of reflected light, will be gazing at the imperial seat of brightness, it becomes a sacrifice to the burning rays, and straight sinks down in penal darkness. It was therefore well said by Philippides the comedian, who, being asked by King Lysimachus what he desired might be imparted to him, replied, "Anything but a secret." And indeed those things in the courts of princes that are most pleasant in themselves and most delightful to be known, such as balls, magnificent entertainments, and all the shows of pomp and greatness, are exposed to common view, nor do they ever hide those divertissements and enjoyments which are the attendants of a prosperous estate. But in what cases soever they seem reserved, as when they are conceiving some high displeasure, or contriving the methods of a revenge, or raging under a fit of jealousy, or suspicious of the disloyal practices of their children, or dubious concerning the treachery of a favorite, come not near, nor intermeddle, for everything is of a dreadful aspect, and of very dangerous access that is thus concealed. Fly from so black a cloud, whose darkness condenses into a tempest, and it will be time enough, when its fury breaks forth with flash and thunder, for thee to observe upon whose head the mischief falls. But to avoid the danger of this curiosity, divert thy thoughts to more safe and delightful inquiries. Survey the wonders of nature in the heavens, earth, the sea, and air, in which thou hast a copious choice of materials for the more sublime as well as the more easy and obvious contemplations. If thy more piercing wit aspires to the noblest inquiries, consider the greater luminary in its diurnal motion, in what part of heaven its morning beams are kindled, and where those chambers of the night are placed which entertain its declining luster. View the moon in all her changes, the just representation of human vicissitudes, and learn the causes that destroy and then restore her brightness. How from an infant spark sprung out of night she swells into a perfect globe of light, and soon her beauties thus repaired die, wasting into their first obscurity. These are indeed the great secrets of nature, whose depth may perhaps amaze and discourage thy inquiries. Search therefore into things more obvious, why the fruits of plants are shaped into such variety of figures, why some are clothed with the verdure of a perennial spring, and others, which sometime were no less fresh and fair, like hasty spendthrifts, lavish away the bounty of heaven in one summer's gaiety, and stand naked to the succeeding frosts. But such harmless speculations will perchance affect thee little, and it may be thou hast that malignity in thy temper which, like venomous beasts that cannot live out of stink and putrefaction, must be ever preying upon the follies and miseries of mankind. Peruse therefore the histories of the world, wherein thou shalt find such vast heaps of wickedness and mischiefs, made up of the downfalls and sudden deaths of great men, the rapes and defilements of women, the treacheries of servants, the falseness of friends, the arts of poisoning, the fatal effects of envy and jealousy, the ruin of families, dethroning of princes, with many other such direful occurrences as may not only delight and satisfy, but even cloy and nauseate thy ill-natured curiosity. But neither, as it appears, are such antiquated evils any agreeable entertainment to people of this perverse disposition. They hearken most to modern tragedies, and such doleful accidents as may be grateful as well for the novelty as the horror of the relation. All pleasant and cheerful converse is irksome to them, so that if they happen into a company that are talking of weddings, the solemnities of sacred rites, or pompous processions, they make as though they heard not, or to divert and shorten the discourse will pretend they knew as much before. Yet if any one should relate how such a wench had a child before the time, or that a fellow was caught with another man's wife, or that certain people were at law with each other, or that there was an unhappy difference between near relations, he no longer sits unconcerned or minds other things, but, with ears pricked up, he listens. What, and when, and how, he asks. Pray say, let's hear it again. And indeed that proverbial saying, ill news goes quick and far, was occasioned chiefly by these busy ill-natured men, who very unwillingly hear or talk of anything else. For their ears, like cupping glasses that attract the most noxious humours in the body, are ever sucking in the most spiteful and malicious reports. And as in some cities there are certain ominous gates through which nothing passes but scavengers' carts, or the sledges of malefactors, so nothing goes in at their ears or out of their mouths but obscene, tragical, and horrid relations. Howling and woe, as in a jail or hell, always infest the places where they dwell. This noise is to them like the siren's song and the sweetest melody, the most pleasant hearing in the world. Now this curiosity, being an affectation of knowledge in things concealed, must needs proceed from a great degree of spite and envy. For men do not usually hide, but ambitiously proclaim whatever is for their honor or interest to be known. And therefore to pry into what is industriously covered can be for no other purpose than that secret delight curious persons enjoy in the discovery of other men's ills, which is spite, and the relief they gather thence, to ease themselves under their tormenting resentment at another's prosperity, which is envy, both which spring from that savage and brutal disposition which we call ill nature. End of section 31.
Section 32 of the Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulais. The Morals, Volume 2, by Plutarch, translated by several hands, corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Of curiosity, or an overbusy inquisitiveness into things impertinent. Part 2. But how ungrateful it is to mankind to have their evils inquired into appears from hence, that some have chosen rather to die than disclose a secret disease to their physician. Suppose then that Herophilus, or Erasistratus, or Aesculapius himself, when he was upon earth, should have gone about from house to house, inquiring whether any there had a fistula in ano, or cancer in utero to be cured. Although such a curiosity as this might in them seem much more tolerable, from the charity of their design and the benefit intended by their art, yet who would not rebuke the saucy officiousness of that quack, who should, unsent for, thus impudently pry into those privy distempers, which the modesty or perhaps the guilt of the patient would blush or abhor to discover, though it were for the sake of a cure? But those that are of this curious and busy humor cannot forbear searching into these, and other ills too that are of a more secret nature, and, what makes the practice more exceedingly odious and detestable, the intent is not to remedy, but expose them to the world. It is not ill taken, if the searchers and officers of the customs do inspect goods openly imported, but only when, with the design of being vexatious and troublesome, they rip up the unsuspected packets of private passengers, and yet even this they are by law authorized to do, and it is sometimes to their loss if they do not. But curious and meddlesome people will be ever inquiring into other men's affairs, without leave or commission, though it be to the great neglect and damage of their own. It is farther observable concerning this sort of men, how averse they are to living long in the country, as being not able to endure the quiet and calm of a retired solitude. But if by chance they take a short ramble to their country house, the main of their business there is more to inquire into their neighbors' concerns than their own, that they may know how other men's fruit trees are blasted, the number of cattle they have lost, and what a scanty harvest they are like to have, and how well their wine keeps. With which impertinent remarks, having filled their giddy brains, the worm wags, and away they must to town again. Now a true-bred rustic, if he by chance meet with any news from the city, presently turns his head another way, and in his blunt language thus reflects upon the impertinence of it. One can't at quiet eat, nor plough one's lawn, so much us country folk, they bear in hand with tales, which idle rascals blow about, how kings, and well, what then? Val in and out. But the busy cit hates the country, as a dull unfashionable thing, and void of mischief, and therefore keeps himself to the town, that he may be among the crowds that throng the courts, exchange and wharfs, and pick up all the idle stories. Here he goes about pumping. What news do you hear? Were not you upon the exchange today, sir? The city's in a very ticklish posture. What do you think on it? In 2 or 3 hours' time we may be altogether by the ears. If he's riding post, he will light off his horse, and even hug and kiss a fellow that has a story to tell him, and stay never so long till he hears it out. But if any one upon demand shall answer, "No news," he replies as in a passion, "What? Have you been neither at the exchange or market today? Have you not been towards the court lately? Have you not heard anything from those gentlemen that newly came out of Italy?" It was, methinks, a good piece of policy among the Locrians, that if any person coming from abroad but once asked concerning news, he was presently confined for his curiosity. For as cooks and fishmongers wish for plenty in the commodities they trade with, so inquisitive people that deal much in news are ever longing for innovations, alterations, variety of action, or anything that is mischievous and unlucky, that they may find store of game for their restless ill nature to hunt and prey upon. Charondas also did well in prohibiting comedians by law from exposing any citizen upon the stage, unless it were for adultery or this malign sort of curiosity. And indeed there is a near affinity between these two vices, for adultery is nothing else but the curiosity of discovering another man's secret pleasures, and the itch of knowing what is hidden, and curiosity is, as it were, a rape and violence committed upon other people's privacies. And now as the accumulation of notions in the head usually begets multiplicity of words, for which reason Pythagoras thought fit to check the too early loquacity of his scholars by imposing on them 5 years' silence for their first admission, so the same curiosity that is thus inquisitive to know is no less intemperate in talking too, and must needs be as ill-spoken as it is ill-natured. And hence it is that curiosity does not only become a restraint to the vices and follies of others, but a disappointment also to itself. For all mankind are exceeding shy of inquisitive persons. No serious business is consulted of where they are, and if they chance to surprise men in the negotiation of any affair, it is presently laid aside as carefully as the housewife locks up her fish from the cat, nor, if it be possible to avoid it, is anything of moment said or done in their company. But whatever is freely permitted to any other people to see, hear, or talk of, is kept as a great secret from persons of this busy impertinent disposition, and there is no man but would commit his letters, papers, and writings to the care of a servant or a stranger, rather than to an acquaintance or relation of this busy and blabbing humor. By the great command which Bellerophon had over his curiosity, he resisted the solicitations of a lustful woman, and, though it were to the hazard of his life, abstained from opening the letters wherein he was designed to be the messenger of his own destruction. For curiosity and adultery, as was intimated before, are both vices of incontinence, only they are aggravated by a peculiar degree of madness and folly, beyond what is found in most other vices of this nature. And can there anything be more sottish than for a man to pass by the doors of so many common prostitutes that are ready to seize him in the streets, and to beleaguer the lodgings of some coy and recluse female that is far from costly, and perhaps far less comely too, than a hackney threepenny strumpet? But such is plainly the frenzy of curious persons, who, despising all those things that are of easy access and unenvied enjoyment, such as are the divertisements of the theatre, the conversation of the ingenious, and the discourses of the learned, must be breaking open other men's letters, listening at their neighbors' doors, peeping in at their windows, or whispering with their servants, a practice which, as it deserves, is commonly dangerous, but ever extremely base and ignominious. Now, to dissuade inquisitive persons, as much as possible, from this sneaking and most despicable humor, it would contribute much if they would but recollect and review all their past observations. For as Simonides, using at certain times to open 2 chests he kept by him, found that wherein he put rewards ever full, and the other appointed for thanks always empty. So, if inquisitive persons did but now and then look into their bag of news, they would certainly be ashamed of that vain and foolish curiosity, which, with so much hazard and trouble to themselves, had been gathering together such a confused heap of worthless and loathsome trash. If a man, in reading over the writings of the ancients, should rake together all the dross he could meet with, and collect into one volume all the unfinished scraps of verse in Homer, the incongruous expressions in the tragedians, or those obscenities of smutty Archilochus, for which he was scorned and pointed at, would not such a filthy scavenger of books well deserve the curse of the tragedian? Pox on your taste! Must you, like lice and fleas, be always fed with scabs and nastiness? But without this imprecation, the practice itself becomes its own punishment, in the dishonest and unprofitable drudgery of amassing together such a noisome heap of other men's vices and follies, a treasure much resembling the city of Poneropolis, or Rogue Town, so called by King Philip after he had peopled it with a crew of rogues and vagabonds. For curious people do so load their dirty brains with the ribaldry and solecisms of other men's writings, as well as the defects and blemishes of their lives, that there is not the least room left in their heads for one witty, graceful, or ingenious thought. There is a sort of people at Rome, who, being unaffected with anything that is beautiful and pretty, either in the works of art or nature, despise the most curious pieces in painting and sculpture, and the fairest boys and girls that are exposed to sale, as not worth their money. Therefore they much frequent the monster market, looking after people of distorted limbs and preternatural shapes, of 3 eyes and pointed heads, and mongrels, where kinds of unlike form oft blended be into one hideous deformity. All which are sights so loathsome, that they themselves would abhor them were they compelled often to behold them. And if they, who curiously inquire into those vicious deformities and unlucky accidents that may be observed in the lives of other men, would only bind themselves to a frequent recollection of what they had seen and heard, there would be found very little delight or advantage in such ungrateful and melancholy reflections. Now, since it is from the use and custom of intermeddling in the affairs of other men, that this perverse practice grows up into such a vicious habit. Therefore the best remedy thereof is, that beginning, as it were, at a distance, and with such things as do less excite the itch of our curiosity, we gradually bring ourselves to an utter desuetude of inquiring into or being concerned at any of those things that do not pertain unto us. Therefore let men first make trial of themselves in smaller and less considerable matters. As for the purpose, why should it be thought such a severe piece of self-denial for any man, as he passes by, to forbear reading the inscriptions that are upon a monument or gravestone, or the letters that are drawn on walls and signposts, if it were but considered that there is nothing more, either for delight or benefit, to be learned thereby, but that certain people had a desire to preserve the memory of their friends and relations by engraving their names on brass or marble, or that some impudent quack or rooking tradesman wants money, and knows no other way to draw men to their shop or lodgings, but by decoying billets and the invitation of a show board? The taking notice of which and such like things may seem for the present harmless, yet there is really a secret mischief wrought by it, while men, suffering their minds to rove so inconsiderately at everything they see, are inured to a foolish curiosity in busying themselves about things impertinent. For as skillful huntsmen do not permit their beagles to fling or change, but lead them forth in couples, that their noses may be kept sharp for their proper game, with scent most quick of nostrils after kind, the tracks of beasts so wild and chaste to find. So ought persons of an inquisitive temper to restrain the wanton excursions of their curiosity, and confine it to observations of prudence and sobriety. Thus the lion and eagle, which walk with their claws sheathed to keep them always pointed for their prey, are an example of that discretion which curious persons should imitate, by carefully preserving those noble faculties of wit and understanding, which were made for useful and excellent enquiries, from being dulled and debauched with low and sottish speculations. The second remedy of this curiosity is that we accustom ourselves in passing by not to peep in at other men's doors or windows, for in this case the hand and eye are much alike guilty, and Xenocrates said, "One may as well go as look into another man's house," because the eye may reach what the hand cannot, and wander where the foot does not come. And besides, it is neither genteel nor civil thus to gaze about. A well-bred person will commonly discover very little that is either meet or delightful to look on, but foul dishes perhaps lying about the floor, or wenches in lazy and immodest postures, and nothing that is decent or in good order. But as one said upon this occasion, "For aught that's here worth seeing, friend, you may e'en turn your prying look another way." And yet, laying aside this consideration of uncomely sights, this very staring and glancing of the eyes to and fro implies such a levity of mind and so great a defect in good manners as must needs render the practice in itself very clownish and contemptible. When Diogenes observed Dioxippus, a victor in the Olympic games, twisting his neck as he sat in his chariot, that he might take the better view of a fair damsel that came to see the sport, "Look," says he, "what a worthy gamester goes there, that even a woman can turn him which way she lists. But these busy-brained people do so twist and turn themselves to every frivolous show, as if they had acquired a veracity in their heads by a custom of gazing at all things round about them. Now methinks it is by no means seemly, that the sense which ought to behave itself as a handmaid to the soul, in doing its errands faithfully, returning speedily, and keeping at home with submissive and reserved modesty, should be suffered, like a wanton and ungovernable servant, to be gadding abroad from her mistress, and straying about at her pleasure. But this happens according to that of Sophocles. And then the Aeneanians' colts disdain the bridle and bit, nor will abide the rein. For so the senses, not exercised and well managed, will at every turn break loose into wild excursions, and hurry reason along with them into the same extravagance. It is said of Democritus, that he voluntarily put out his eyes by the reflection of a burning glass, that, as by the darkening of windows, sometimes done for the same purpose, he might not by the allurements of sense be called off from attending to his purely intellectual contemplations. Although the story be false, yet this at least is true, that those men who are most addicted to profound speculations do least of all converse with impressions of sense, and therefore, to prevent that interruption and disturbance which either noise or impertinent visits might be to their philosophical inquiries, they place their studies at some distance from cities, and call the night Euphrone, from Euphron, of good understanding, thinking that its quiet and stillness from all disturbances made it the fittest season for meditation. Farther, to forbear mixing with a crowd of fellows that are quarreling in the marketplace, or to sit still while the mad rabble are rioting in the streets, or at least to get out of hearing of it, will not be very difficult to any man that considers how little there is to be gained by intermeddling with busy and unquiet people, and how great the certain advantage is of bridling our curiosity, and bringing it under subjection to the commands of reason. And thus, when by this more easy discipline a man hath acquired some power over himself, exercises of greater difficulty are to be attempted, as for instance, to forbear the theatre upon the tempting fame of some new and much applauded play, to resist the importunity of a friend that invites thee to a ball, an entertainment at the tavern, or a concert of music, and not to be transported if thou chance at a distance to hear the din of a racecourse or the noise at the circus. For as Socrates advises well, that men should abstain from tasting those meats and drinks which, by their exquisite pleasantness, tempt the palate to exceed the sober measures of thirst and hunger, so are all those obluxions of the ear and eye to be avoided which are apt to entice men into impertinence or extravagance. When Araspes had commended the fair Panthea to Cyrus as a beauty worth his admiration, he replied, "For that very reason I will not see her, lest if by thy persuasion I should see her but once, she herself might persuade me to see her often, and spend more time with her than would be for the advantage of my own affairs." So Alexander, upon like consideration, would not trust his eyes in the presence of the beautiful Queen of Persia, but kept himself out of the reach of her charms, and treated only with her aged mother. But we, alas, that no opportunity may be lost of doing ourselves all the mischief we can by our curiosity, cannot forbear prying into sedans and coaches, or gazing at the windows, or peeping under the balconies, where women are. Nay, we must be staring about from the housetop, to spy out all occasions of our ruin, and are all the while so sottishly inconsiderate as to apprehend no danger from giving such a boundless license to our wandering eyes. Now, as in point of justice and honesty, it conduces much to prevent our defrauding and overreaching other men, if we now and then, in smaller matters, voluntarily abate somewhat of our strict dues. And as it is a means to keep men chaste and continent to all other women, if they sometimes forbear the lawful enjoyment of their own wives, so will these excesses of curiosity be cured by the same restraints, if, instead of inquiring into what concerns other men, we can prevail with ourselves, so far as to not hear or see all that is done in our own houses, nor to listen to everything that may be told concerning ourselves or our private affairs. Oedipus by his curiosity fell into great mischief, for, being a parentage to himself unknown, and now at Corinth where he was a stranger, he went about asking questions concerning himself, and lighting on Laius he slew him. And then by the marriage of the queen, who was his own mother, he obtained the government. Not contented with the thoughts of being thus happy, he must needs once more, against all the persuasions of his wife, be inquiring concerning himself, when, meeting with an old man that was privy to the whole contrivance, he pressed him earnestly to reveal the secret. And when he now began to suspect the worst, the old man cried out, "Alas, so sad a tale to tell I dread." But he, burning with impatience of knowing all, replied, "And I to hear it, but yet it must be said." Thus oddly mixed with pain and pleasure is this restless itch of curiosity, that, like a healing wound, will hazard the loss of blood rather than want the seeming ease of being rubbed and scratched. but such as either by good nature or good discipline are free from this disease, and have experienced the invaluable felicity of a calm and undisturbed spirit, will rather rejoice in being ignorant than desire to be informed of the wickedness and the miseries that are in the world, and will sit down well satisfied in this opinion. How sage and wise art thou, Oblivion! Wherefore, as a farther help to check the impatience of our curiosity, it will contribute much to practice such acts of abstinence as these. If a letter be brought thee, lay it aside for some time before thou read it, and do not, as many do, eagerly fall upon the seal with tooth and nail, as soon as it ever comes by thy hands, as if it were scarce possible to open it with sufficient speed. When a messenger returns, do not hastily rise up and run towards him, as if thou couldst not hear what he had to say time enough. And if any one makes an offer to tell thee something that is new, say that thou hadst rather it were good and useful. When at a public dissertation I sometime made at Rome, Rusticus, who afterwards perished by the mere envy of Domitian, was one of my auditors, a messenger comes suddenly in with an express from Caesar. Upon which, when I offered to be silent till he had perused the paper, he desired me to proceed, nor would so much as look into it till the discourse was ended and the audience dismissed, all that were present much admiring the gravity of the man. In great persons, whose power encourages them to greater licentiousness, this vicious curiosity is hardly curable, for when it is arrived in them to the consistence of an inveterate habit, they will never undergo those previous restraints upon their outward actions which are necessary to destroy the evil habit within them. For such as are thus inured will be breaking up other men's letters, intruding upon the privacies of their friends, making bold inquiries into the unfathomable mysteries of religion, profaning sacred places and holy offices by their coming where and doing what they ought not, and even prying into the most secret acts and discourses of princes. All or any of which odious practices it will be hard for any one after long custom to forbear, but especially for great persons. And indeed princes themselves, who are concerned to have as particular knowledge of all things as they can, and to whom it is in some sort necessary for the ends of government to maintain spies and intelligencers about them, are usually hated for nothing more than their retaining this lewd sort of people in quality of eavesdroppers of state and public informers. The first that employed this kind of officers was Jairus in his younger years, when he could not confide in himself nor durst trust any one else. The Sicilian tyrants afterwards planted them in Syracuse, but upon a revolution that happened there, the people first fell upon these informers and destroyed them without mercy. Of near infinity with these are common accusers, which from a particular occasion imported in the word, were called sycophants, fig blabbers, because, upon the prohibited exportation of that fruit, they became informers against those that broke this order. Much the like sort of people were those in Athens, when a dearth of grain happened and the corn sellers were commanded to bring out their stores for public sale, and those that went about listening at the mills and prying into granaries, that they might find matter of information against offenders, were thence called aliterians, or, if you please, mill clackers. Which consideration, superadded to the rest that has been said, is enough to render this sort of malign curiosity extremely execrable, and to be highly abhorred and most carefully avoided by every man who would desire, for mere reputation's sake, not to be ranked among the profligate crew of villains, which are looked upon as the most detestable of all mankind. End of section 32.
Section 33 of The Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands. Corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. How a man may be sensible of his progress in virtue. Part 1. My friend Sossius Senecio. Is it possible, do you think, that all the arguments in the world can make a man sensibly assured that he is a proficient in virtue, upon this supposition that his proceedings do not in the least alleviate and abate his folly, but that the vice in him, weighing in equal balance against his good inclinations, hold him down as heavy lead pulls down the yielding net? In the study of music or grammar, I am sure, such a conclusion would be very absurd, for the scholar could never be certain that he had made an improvement in those sciences, if all the while he is a-learning, he did not exhaust by little and little his former ignorance about them, but remained during the whole progress of his application under the same degree of unskilfulness as at first setting out. The like may be said of those that are under the hands of a physician. According to this assertion, if the patient take physic, which does not recruit his strength or give him ease by abating the severity of the distemper, it is absolutely impossible that he should discern any alteration in himself, before the contrary habit is perfectly and in the highest degree induced, and his body thoroughly sound and well. As in these instances, you cannot say the persons have advanced at anything, so long as they perceive no sensible change in themselves by the abatement of the contrary weight, and do not find that their minds are elevated, as it were, in the opposite scale. Just so, in truth, is it with those that profess philosophy. They cannot be assured of any progress or improvement, if the soul do not gradually advance and purge off the rest of its former imperfections, but still lie under the like equal pressure and grievance of pure, absolute, unmixed evil, till it have attained the state of perfect, supreme good. For the truth of it is, a wise man cannot in a moment of time change from the lowest degree of vice imaginable to the most heroic perfection of virtue, if he only make a brisk attempt to throw off vice all at once, and do not constantly and resolutely endeavour by little and little to lighten the burthen and dispossess the evil habit of it. You know very well how much trouble those give themselves who maintain this assertion, and what strange questions they raise with regard to it. For instance, why a wise, virtuous man should never perceive how he became such, but should either be quite ignorant, or at least doubt, that ever by little and little, now adding something, now subtracting and removing others, he advanced to the aggregate perfection of virtue. Now if, as they affirm, the change from bad to good were either so quick and sudden, as that he that was extremely vicious in the morning may become eminently virtuous at night, or that any one going to bed wicked might chance to rise a virtuous man next morning, and, having all the former day's errors and imperfections absolutely removed out of his mind, might say to them, as it is in the poet, "Vain dreams, farewell, like spectres haste away, at the new light of virtue's glorious day." Do you think that any one in the world could be ignorant of so extraordinary a conversion, and perfectly shut his eyes upon the beams of virtue and wisdom so fully and manifestly breaking in upon his soul? In my opinion, if any person should have Seneus's foolish wish, and be changed, as it is reported he was, from one sex to the other, it is more probable that such a one should be altogether ignorant of the metamorphosis, than that any should, from a lazy, unthinking, debauched fellow, commence a wise, prudent, and valiant hero, and from a sottish bestiality advance to the perfection of divine life, and yet know nothing at all of the change. It is very good advice. Measure the stone by your rule, and not your rule by the stone. But the Stoics have not observed it. For they, not applying principles to things, but forcing things which have no foundation of agreement in nature, to agree to their principles, have filled philosophy with a number of difficulties. One of the hardest to be solved is this, that all men whatsoever, except him who is absolutely perfect, are equally vicious. Hence is that enigma, called progress or proficiency, which, though it has puzzled the learned to solve, is in my opinion very foolish, for it represents those that have advanced a little, and are partly free from inordinate passions and distempers of mind, to be as unhappy as those that are guilty of the most heinous enormities. And indeed the assertion is so absurd, that their own actions are enough to confute it. For while they maintain in their schools that Aristides and Phalaris are equally unjust, that Brasidas and Dolon are equal cowards, and that Plato and Meletus are equally senseless, still in all affairs of life they seem to reject and avoid the latter of these, as too harsh and severe to be softened into compliance, but credit and quote the former in all their writings as persons of extraordinary worth and esteem. This is what the Stoics assert. But we, who can better agree with Plato in this point, finding by observation that in all kinds of evils, especially that of a weak and unmanaged disposition of mind, there are several degrees of more and less, for herein one advance differs from another, that the miserable darkness which the soul lies under begins more sensibly to abate, when reason by little and little illuminates and purges the soul, may be bold to affirm that the change from bad to good is very easily and manifestly discernible, not as if one were drawn out of a pit on a sudden, and could give no account of the degrees of the ascent, but so plain that the several steps and advances may be computed. The first argument that comes in my mind is this, by way of simile. Pray examine it. You know the art of navigation. When the seamen hoist sail for the main ocean, they give judgment of their voyage by observing together the space of time and the force of the wind that driveth them, and compute that, in all probability, in so many months, with such a gale, they have gone forward to such or such a place. Just so it is in the study of philosophy. One may, if he mind it, give a probable conjecture of a scholar's proceedings. He that is always at his business, constantly upon the road, never makes any steps or halts, nor meets with obstacles and lets in the way, but under the conduct of right reason travels smoothly, securely, and quietly along, may be assured that he has one true sign of a proficient, this of the poet: add many lesser numbers in account, your total will to a vast sum amount. Not only holds true as to the increase of money, but also may serve as a rule to the knowledge of the advance of everything else, especially of proficiency in virtue. Reason, besides its ordinary influence, requires the constancy of application and address which is necessary and usual in all other affairs. Whereas, on the contrary, the irregular proceedings and inconsistent, silly assertions of some philosophers do not only lay rubs in the way, and break the measures of a virtuous improvement, but seem to give great advantage to vice, during their lingering and idling upon their journey, to tempt them into bypaths, or over-persuade them to return whence they set out. Astronomers tell us that planets, after they have finished their progressive motion, for some small time acquiesce and become stationary, as they term it. Now in the study of philosophy it is not so. There is no point of rest or acquiescence during the whole procedure, for the nature of progress is to be always advancing, more or less. The scales in which our actions are, as it were, weighed, cannot at all stand in equilibrio, but our soul is continually either raised by the addition of good, or cast with the counterpoise of evil. Therefore, as the oracle told the Circaeans that they ought to fight continually, day and night, so you and every wise man ought to be perpetually upon your guard, and if you can be assured that you maintain a constant combat with vice, that you are always at enmity with it, and never so much as come to terms, or receive any diversions, applications, or avocations, as so many heralds from the enemy's camp, in order to a treaty with it, then you may, with a great deal of confidence and alacrity, go on with the management of your warlike expedition, and very reasonably at last expect a conquest, and enjoy a crown of righteousness for your reward. It is another very good argument to prove that by labour and exercise you have shaken off all stupidity and sluggishness of temper, and that you are arrived at a perfection of virtue, if for the future your resolutions may be more firm, and your application more intense, than they were when you first set out. This appears true, if you but observe contrary. In order to a treaty with it, then you may, with a great deal of confidence and alacrity, go on with the management of your warlike expedition, and very reasonably at last expect a conquest, and enjoy a crown of righteousness for your reward. It is another very good argument to prove that by labour and exercise you have shaken off all stupidity and sluggishness of temper, and that you are arrived at a perfection of virtue, if for the future your resolutions be more firm, and your application more intense than they were when you first set out. This appears true, if you but observe its contrary. For it is a very bad sign if, after a small time spent in trial, you find many and repeated intermissions, or your affections yielding or cool in the pursuit. This may be illustrated by what is observable in the growth of a cane. At first it appears above ground, with a full and pleasing sprout, which by little and little, taper-wise, by a continued and equal distribution of matter, rises to a very great height. Towards the root you may observe that there are formed certain steps and joints, which are at a considerable distance from one another, because there the juice is plentiful and strong, but toward the top the nutrimentive particles vibrate and palpitate, as if they were quite spent with the length of their journey, and thereupon you see they form themselves many small, weak, and tender joints, as so many supports and breathing places. So it happens with those that study philosophy. At first setting out they take long steps and make great advances, but if after some attempts they perceive not in themselves any alteration for the better, but meet with frequent checks and avocations the further they go, ordinarily they faint, make any excuses to be off from their engagement, despond of ever going through with it, and thereupon proceed no farther. But on the contrary, he that is winged with desire flies at the proposed advantage, and by a stout and vigorous pursuit cuts off all pretences of delay from crowding in upon him or hindering his journey. In love, it is a sign the passion is predominant, if the lover be not only pleased in the enjoyment of the beloved object, for that's ordinary, but also troubled and grieved at the absence of it. After a manner not unlike this, many youngsters, as I've observed, stand affected at the study of philosophy. At first they buckle to their work with the greatest concern and emulation imaginable, but as soon as ever they are diverted, either by business or any little pretences, the heat of their affection immediately flies off, and they sit down ignorant, and very well content. But he that perceives the pleasing sting of love, whose poignant joy his trembling heart doth move, will not only show that he is a proficient by his virtuous demeanour and agreeableness in all company and discourse, but if he be called from his business, you may perceive him all on fire, in pain, and uneasy in whatsoever he does, either alone or in company, and so concerned that he is unmindful of his best friends, till he is restored to the quest of his beloved philosophy. All of us ought to imitate such a noble example in all our studies. We must not be affected with good discourse only while we are in place, as we are with rich fragrant perfumes, which we never mind, but while we are a-smelling to them. But if by chance marriage, an estate, love, or a campaign take us from our business, we must still hunger and thirst after virtue, and the more our proficiency is advanced, by so much the more ought our desire to know what we have not attained disquiet and excite us to the further pursuit and knowledge of it. The grave account which Hesiod gives of proficiency is, in my judgment, either the very same, or comes very near to this, which I have now set down. Proficiency is, says he, when all difficulties are removed, all unevenness smoothed and cleared, and the way made easy and passable. It must be smoothed by frequent exercise, cleared by beams of divine light that guide the way to true philosophy. Nothing at all of the clouds of doubt, error, or inconstancy in good resolutions remaining, which are as usually incident to learners in their first attempts upon philosophy, as distraction and solicitudes are to those who, sailing from an unknown land, cannot yet discover the place whither they are bound. Thus I have known impatient sophisters skip over common and ordinary notions, before they have learned or attained better, and lose themselves in the middle of their journey in so troublesome a maze, that they would be willing to return, if they could, to their primitive state of quiet, inactive ignorance. Sextius, a nobleman of Rome, may serve for an instance of this. He quitted all offices and places of honour, that he might more freely and undisturbedly apply himself to the study of philosophy. At first he met with many difficulties, and finding himself unable to encounter or conquer them, out of very despair and despondency, he had thoughts of throwing himself out of a little boat into the river Tiber. Parallel to this was a merry story told by Diogenes of Sinope. When he first put on his gown, it happened to be at a time when the Athenians celebrated a festival with extraordinary banquets, night drinking, sports, and pageantry usual at great solemnities. The philosopher, as he lay in the holidays in the corner of the street, muffled up in his clothes, to try if he could take a nap, had some running thoughts in his head, which checked the resolutions he had taken as to a philosophical life, and troubled him extremely. He reasoned with himself that there was no necessity for his entering into so troublesome and singular a way of living, that he thereby deprived himself of all the sweets and pleasures of life, and the like. While he was thinking thus with himself, he espied, as the story goes, a mouse venturing toward him, and now and then nibbling at a mouldy crust that he had in his pouch. This sight, which is much, turned his thoughts, and made him vexed and troubled at himself as much on the other side. What, says he, is the matter with thee, Diogenes? Thou seest this tiny mouse lives well, and is very glad of thy scraps. But thou, who must needs be a person of quality, forsooth, art extremely sorry and out of humour, because thou durst not feast upon down beds, and canst not have the genteel privilege at this merry time to be drunk as well as others. Another rational argument of gradual proficiency is when avocations are not frequent upon us, and when they happen, very short, while the substantial rules and precepts of wisdom, as if they had been violently driven out, presently return upon our minds, and dispossess all empty trouble and disconsolate thoughts. And because scholars do not only fancy to themselves difficulties big enough to divert their weak resolutions, but also often meet with serious persuasions from their friends to leave their studies, and because sometimes such smart jests and drolls are put upon them as have often discouraged, frequently quite converted. The endeavours of some, it may seem to you a very good argument of a proficient, if you find yourself indifferent and unconcerned in that point. As, for example, not to be cut to the heart and repine, when you are told that such and such persons by name, your equals once, live splendidly at court, have married great fortunes, or have appeared publicly at the head of a great many freeholders that are ready to vote for them for some great office or representative's place. He that is neither discomposed nor very much affected by such news as this is manifestly in the right, and has philosophy by the surer handle. For it is impossible we should leave admiring things which most men esteem, if the habit of virtue were not deeply rooted in us. To avoid passionately what every one cries down may be in some persons the effect of anger and ignorance, but utterly to despise what is admired abroad is a certain sign of true and solid wisdom and resolution. With what satisfaction and complacency many persons advanced to such a height of virtue compare themselves with others, and break out in these verses of Solon: "We will not change virtue's immortal crown for a whole mine of gold. Gold is uncertain, but what we possess is still our own, and never can be less." None can deny that it was very great in Diogenes to compare his shifting from the city of Corinth to Athens, and from Thebes to Corinth, to the king of Persia's taking his progress in the spring to Susa, in winter to Babylon, and to Media in summer. Nor was it an argument of a much less spirit in Agesilaus, who, hearing this same king of Persia styled the Great, presently asked, "In what is he greater than I, if he be not juster than I am?" Aristotle himself had exactly such notions in the like case. For, writing to Antipater about his scholar Alexander, he says of him, that he ought not to value himself in this respect, that he was advanced above others, for whoever had a true notion of God was really as great as he. And Zeno too deserves to be mentioned, who, hearing Theophrastus commended above any of the philosophers for his number of scholars, put it off thus: "His choir is indeed larger than mine, but mine has the sweeter voices." For all these instances you may collect this great truth, that whenever you do, by setting the comforts of virtue and the difficulties and errors of study one against the other, perceive that you have utterly expelled all emulation, jealousy, and everything else that uses to disturb or discourage young men, you may then assuredly conclude with yourself that you have made very laudable progress. Another argument of proficiency in virtue is the alteration of your very style of writing, and of your way of managing any argument or discourse. Most of those that nowadays design for scholars, in ordinary speaking, do prosecute almost none but popular studies, to furnish out discourse, and make themselves, as the phrase is, plausible men. Some few of them there are who, like silly larks, are taken with the glaring light of natural philosophy, and measuring themselves by their own levity and conceit, think they are able presently to attain the height of that science. Others, like young whelps, 'tis Plato's simile, love to snap and bite at one another, only to gratify a contentious, sceptical, and sophistical humour, which they at first got by bad tuition and ill-managed studies. Some again, as soon as even they are initiated in the principles of logic, presently commence sophisters. Others spend their whole time in collecting sentences and historical narrations. These, as Anacharsis said of the Grecians, that he saw no occasion they had for money, but only to count and tell it over, have nothing at all to do, but go about singing and repeating what they have collected into commonplace books, without any other benefit or satisfaction from their labours. To these you may apply that of Antiphanes, which one ingeniously turned to Plato's scholars. This Antiphanes said merrily, that in a certain city the cold was so intense that words were congealed as soon as spoken, but that after some time they thawed and became audible, so that the words spoken in winter were articulated next summer. Even so, the many excellent precepts of Plato, which he instilled into the tender ears of his scholars, were scarce perceived and distinguished by many of them, till they grew men and attained the warm vigorous summer of their age. Such a cool disposition to virtue and philosophy, as that philosopher said was in Plato's scholars when young, often lasts in the most of us, as was hinted before, till our judgments grow to a solid firmness and maturity, and we begin to value those precepts that are able to beget a composure and greatness of mind, and diligently to trace and follow those discourses and precepts, whose tracks, as it is in Aesop's fables, rather look inward than outward, to ourselves rather than others. Sophocles said of himself, that in writing his tragedies, he first of all abated and pricked the humour of Aeschylus's invention, and then corrected the harshness and over-artifice of his composition, and, last of all, changed his very style and elocution, the thing which is most considerably persuasive, and which most of all conduces to good manners. Even so, young students, when they pass from the fullness and luxuriancy of panegyric and declamation to that more solid part of philosophy that regulates manners and smooths all the rugged and disorderly passions, then begin really to attain true and solid proficiency. Hereupon let me advise you this: wherever you read the writings or hear the orations of the philosophers, attend always things more than words, and be not taken with what is curious and of a delicate thread and contexture, more than that which is strong, nervous, and beneficial. So also in perusing poems or histories, be sure that nothing escapes you that is appositely said, in relation to the cultivating of manners, or the calming turbulent, immoderate passions, but always give it a note, and make it surely your own. Simonides said that a student of philosophy should be like a bee, that laborious creature, when it is amongst flowers, makes it its business industriously to extract the yellow honey out of them all, while others care and seek for nothing else except the smell and the colour. So while some others employ their time in reading the poets only for diversion, or for the wit and fancy which usually adorn their works, you, my dear friend, like a bee amongst a swarm of drones, observe and collect what is sweet, palatable, and worthy your pains, and seem already, by your constant custom and application, to have attained a perfect knowledge of what is eminently good and proper. As to those that peruse the works of Plato and Xenophon only for the style's sake, and do cull out what is elegant and Attic, as the cream and flower of those authors, pray what do they do, but as it were admire the fragrancy and flavour of medicinal drugs, yet at the same time neither understand nor inquire after their healing and purgative qualities? Whereas those that have advanced to a higher degree of perfection can extract benefit, not only from philosophical discourses, but also from everything they see or do, and thence draw something that may be proper and fit for their purpose. I will give you some examples of Aeschylus and other very eminent men, which may be very pat to this purpose. Aeschylus chanced to be a spectator at the Isthmian games, where some were engaged at sword-play. Seeing one of the combatants wound, and observing that the theatre immediately made a great shouting and hollowing upon it, he jogged one iron and an inhabitant of the island Chios, and sat next to him, and whispered him thus: "Do you see what exercise can do? He that is wounded holds his peace, and the spectators cry out, Brasidas, the Lacedaemonian captain, by chance caught a mouse among some dry figs, and, being bit by her, let her go, with this exclamation, "By Hercules, there is no creature so little or so weak that it cannot preserve its life if it dares but defend it." Diogenes may serve for 1,000 instances. When he saw a boy drink out of the palm of his hand, he threw away his dish, which he used to carry always with him in his wallet. Thus sedulity and application have a singular virtue to make us knowing and able to extract motives to virtue from everything that we meet with. For it is not a difficult matter to attain such a temper of mind, if the candidates for virtue intermix discourse and reading with their actions, not only exercising themselves amidst dangers, as Thucydides said to some, but also engaging pleasures, disputing hard questions, examining precedents, pleading causes, and so on, to try themselves thoroughly, undertaking some magistracy or public office, giving thereby demonstration of their opinions and resolution, or rather establishing their resolution by exercise. Whereas those that are not bred to it, but like novices, spy out and catch at anything that is curious in books, and pragmatically run away with it either to the exchange, the college, or some club or tavern, deserve no more the name of philosophers than those quacks that only truck off vile drugs and potions merit the character and value of physicians. Those sophisters seem to me not unlike the bird mentioned in Homer, and to have something of its quality. Whatsoever they catch abroad they presently bring home with them, and cram it into their unfledged chicks, their illiterate scholars, starving their own empty crops the while, as the poet has it. For they neither digest nor convert what they take into true nourishment. It is then indispensably our duty so to manage our discourse, that it may be beneficial both to ourselves and others, we not incurring the censure of being thought vainglorious or arrogant by any. To be always readier to hear than to teach, and especially so to abate and moderate all vehemency and passionate quarrelling about trivial questions, as that we may cease to attend and manage disputations with the same indifferency as you may have seen some exercise hurlbats and cudgelling, that is, so as to leave the stage with more satisfaction for having had a true hit or coming off conquer, than for having either learned ourselves or taught our antagonist any manner of skill by the engagement. An evenness and mildness of temper in all such affairs, which never will suffer us to enter the lists of vehemency and passion, nor to be hot and concerned in settling an argument, nor to scold and give bad words when we have vanquished our adversary, nor to be very much dejected if we chance to be quite baffled, is, I think, a true sign of a great proficient in virtue. Aristippus was a great example of this, for, when in a set disputation, he was baffled by the sophistry and forehead of an impudent, wild, and ignorant disputant, and observed him to be flushed and high with the conquest. "Well," says the philosopher, "I am certain I shall sleep quieter tonight than my antagonist." Not only upon the close and event of our philosophical contests, but even in the midst of disputation, we may, privately, take an estimate of this good quality in us, which is a sign of a true proficient. For example, if upon a greater appearance of auditors than was expected, we be not afraid nor in confusion, if for the thinness of the congregation, when there are but a few to hear us, we be not dejected and troubled, and lastly, if, when we are to speak before a numerous or honourable assembly, we do not, for want of fitting preparation, miss the opportunity for ever. It is reported that 2 as famous orators as ever were, Demosthenes and Alcibiades, were somewhat weak and faulty in this point. The timorousness of the former is known to every schoolboy. And as for Alcibiades, though he was, as must be confessed, as sagacious and happy in his thoughts as any man whatever, yet, for want of a little assurance in speaking a thing, he very often miserably lost himself in his pleadings, for he would falter and make pauses in the very middle of his orations, purely for want of a single word or some neat expression that he had in his papers but could not presently remember. To give you another instance of the prince of poets, Homer, he was so blinded with an over-confidence of his abilities in poetry that he has slipped a false quantity and left it on record in the very first verse of his Iliads. Seeing then the learnedest men and greatest artists have failed, and may fail for want of caution or confidence, it ought more nearly to concern those that earnestly follow virtue, not to slip the least opportunity of improvement, either by company or otherwise, and not overmuch to regard the throng or applause of the theatre, when they do exercise or make any solemn harangue. End of section 33. Recording by Luke Sartor, Griffith, New South Wales. Section 34 of The Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands. Corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. How a man may be sensible of his progress in virtue. Part 2. Nor is it enough that one take care of all his discourses and orations, but he ought also to observe that the whole tenor of his actions be guided by profit rather than vain pomp, and by truth rather than ostentation. For if a passionate lover who has placed his affection upon any beloved object seeks no witnesses to attest its sincerity, but has such an eager desire when alone and in private that, like a covered flame, it burns more vigorously and insensibly for being shut up, much more ought a moralist and a philosopher, who has attained both the habit and exercise of virtue, sit down self-contented, and applaud himself in private, neither needing nor desiring encomiasts or auditors from abroad. There is a humour in some of the poets, of an old peevish housekeeper, that calls to his maid aloud, "Do you see, Dionysia," that is his maid's name, "I am now pleased, and have laid by all choler and passion." Just such like is the practice of some, who, as soon as they have done anything which is obliging and civil, presently blaze it abroad, and turn their own heralds. Such men show plainly that they look beyond themselves for satisfaction, that they are desirous of praise and applause, and that they never were admitted near spectators of virtue, never saw her in her noble royal dress, but only had some transient sight of her in a dream, or an empty airy phantasm, and indeed, that they expose their actions to the public, as painters do their pictures, to be gazed at and admired by the gaping multitude. Any sign of a proficient in virtue is, when the proficient has given anything to his friend or done any kindness for anyone, if he keeps it to himself and does not blab it to anybody, and, which is more, if he hath voted right against a majority of biased suffragans, withstood the dishonest attempts of some rich and powerful man, generously rejected bribes when offered, abstained from inordinate drinking when athirst and alone, or at night when none sees or knows what he does. Lastly, if he hath conquered the briskest attempts of love, as is said of Agesilaus, if, I say, he contain himself from speaking of such actions, and do not in company boast of his performances. This I affirm, such a one as can prove and try himself by himself, and be fully satisfied in the verdict of his conscience, as of an unexceptional witness and spectator of what is right and good, shows plainly that his reason looks inward and is well rooted within him, and that the man, as Democritus said, is accustomed to take satisfaction from himself. To borrow a simile from husbandmen, and those that are concerned in the business of the fields, they are always best pleased to see those ears of corn which decline, and by reason of their fullness bend downwards to the earth, but look upon those as empty, deceitful, and insignificant, which, because they have nothing in them, grow bolt upright and appear above the rest. So it is amongst students in philosophy. Those that are most empty-headed and have least firmness and solidity have always the greatest share of confidence, formality, and stiffness in their address, look biggest, walk with the most state, and top upon and condemn others with the highest arrogance and severity of any living. But when once their brains begin to fill and become well poised with solid notions, they look down into themselves, and quite lay aside that insolent and arrogant humour, which is proper only to youngsters. Give me leave to illustrate this by one simile more. When you pour water into bottles or any other vessels, upon its being instilled into them, the air that was in them before presently flies out and gives place to the more substantial body. Even so it is with those that have had many good precepts instilled into them, and their minds replenished with solid truths. They presently find that all empty vanity flies off, that the imposthume of pride breaks, that they do not value themselves for beard and gown only, but bend their actions and endeavours to the bettering of their rational faculties. And lastly, that when they reprove, they begin at home, turning the edge of their satire and invective upon themselves, even when at the same time they are civil and complacent to all others beside. It is indeed an argument of a generous and truly brave disposition in a scholar, not to assume the name and character of one, and, as some used to do, to put the philosopher amongst his titles, but if any out of respect chance to give him that compellation, to be surprised, blush, and with a modest smile answer him in that of the poet, "You compliment your friend, he whom you so commend, must needs be more than man, far more than I pretend." Aeschylus says of a young woman that, if ever she have played the wanton, you may discover it in her eyes and read her affections in amorous glances, which she cannot conceal. So a young scholar, if he be once entered in the mysteries, and have tasted the sweets of philosophy, cannot possibly suppress the passion and concern for it. As Sappho says, his tongue falters when he would speak its praise. His heart is warm with affection. A secret flame does run through every part. You will admire and love the assurance and composedness of his looks, the affectionateness of his eyes, and especially the winning decency and agreeableness of his words and expressions. Those that are to be initiated in the ceremonies of the gods run to their temples at first with a great deal of noise, clamour, and rudeness. But as soon as the solemnity is seen and over, they attend with a profound silence and religious fear. So it is with the candidates in philosophy. You may perceive a throng, noise, and pother about the school doors, by reason that several press thither eagerly, rudely, and violently for reputation more than learning. But when you are once in and manifestly see the great light, as if some royal shrine were opened unto you, you are presently possessed with a quite different notion of things, are struck with silence and admiration, and begin with humility and a reverent composure to comply with and follow the divine oracle. That which Menedemus said in another case is very apposite to this sort of men. Those that went to the school of Athens were first of all wise, next lovers of wisdom, then orators, and at last, in course of time, plain, common men. For the longer they applied themselves to study and philosophy, so much the more all vanity, pride, and pedantry abated in them, and the nearer they came to plain, downright, honest men. Again, as it is with those that are indisposed and out of order, some, if a tooth or finger do but ache, presently run to a physician. Others send for one to their houses, if they find themselves but the least feverish, and desire his advice and assistance. But those that are either melancholical, or, but any ways crazed in their heads, cannot endure so much as the looks of a physician, but either keep out of sight when he comes, or command him to be gone, being altogether insensible of their condition. So in persons that commit any heinous crime, or fall into any error, I look upon those as perfectly incurable, who take it ill to be admonished of their fault, and look upon reproof and admonition as the greatest rudeness and incivility in the world. Whereas those that can quietly hearken, and submit to the advice of friends and superiors, deserve a more favourable opinion, and may be thought to be of a much better disposition. But the greatest character of hopeful men, and such as may be probably excellent proficients in time, belongs to those who, upon a commission of a fault, immediately apply themselves to such as will reprove and correct them, who plainly disclose their grief and open their malady, who do not rejoice in concealing their distemper, and are not content to have their troubles unknown. Lastly, who make a full confession of what they have done amiss, and desire the help of a friend to examine and direct them for the future. Diogenes, I am sure, was of this opinion. He said that whatsoever would be certainly and constantly in the right must get either a virtuous good friend or an incensed, ill-natured enemy to his monitor, the one by gentle admonition to reprove and persuade him, the other to work upon him by severity, and awe him into a virtuous course of life. There is a sort of men in the world that are so vain and foolish as to take a pride in being the first discoverers of their own imperfections. If they have but a rent or spot in their clothes, or have got a torn pair of shoes on, they're the most forward of any to tell it in company, and, which is more, they are very apt, out of a silly, empty, arrogant humour, to make themselves the subject of their drollery. If they are of a dwarfish stature, or any way deformed. Yet, which is strange, these very men, at the very same time, endeavour to excuse and palliate the internal imperfections of the mind, and the more ugly deformities of the soul, as envy, evil custom, detraction, voluptuousness, etc., and will not suffer any one either to see or probe them. These are, as it were, so many sore places, and they cannot endure to have them touched and meddled with. Such men as these, I may be bold to say, have very few signs of proficiency, or rather none at all. Now, on the contrary, he that examines his own failings with the greatest severity, that impartially blames or corrects himself as often as he does amiss, or, which is almost as commendable, grows firmer and better by present advice, as well as more able and ready to endure a reprimand for the future, seems to me truly and sincerely to have rejected and forsaken vice. It is certainly our duty to avoid all appearance of evil, and to be ashamed to give occasion, even to be reputed vicious. Yet evil reports are so inconsiderable to a wise man, that, if he have a greater aversion to the nature of evil than to the infamy that attends it, he will not fear what is said of him abroad, nor what calumnies are raised, if so be he be made the better by them. It was handsomely said of Diogenes when he saw a young spark coming out of a tavern, who at the sight of him drew back. "Do not retire," says he, "for the more you go backward, the more you will be in the tavern." Even so, every vicious person, the more he denies and palliates vice, the more aggravates and confirms it, and with surer footing goes farther into wickedness, like some persons of ordinary rank and quality who, while they assume above themselves, and out of arrogance would be thought rich, are made really poor and necessitous by pretending to be otherwise. Hippocrates, a man of wonderful skill in physic, was very ingenious in this point, and fit to be imitated by the greatest proficients in philosophy. He confessed publicly that he had mistaken the nature of the sutures in the skull, and has left an acknowledgment of his ignorance upon record, under his own hand. For he thought it very unworthy a man of his profession not to discover where he was in the wrong, seeing others might suffer and err by his authority. And indeed, it had been very unreasonable, if he, whose business and concern it was to save others and to set them right, should not have had the courage to cure himself and to discover his weakness and imperfections in his own faculty. Pyrrhon and Bion, two eminent philosophers, have given rules of proficiency, but they seem rather signs of a complete habit of virtue than a progressive disposition to it. Bion told his friend that they then might be assured of their proficiency, when they could endure a reproof from anybody with the same indifferency and unconcernedness as they could hear the highest encomiums, even such a one as this of the poet: "Sir, some heavenly flame inspires your breast. Live great, rejoice, and be forever blessed." The other, to wit, Pyrrhon, being at sea and in great danger, by reason of a tempest that arose, took particular notice, as the story goes, of a hog that was on board, which all the while very unconcernedly fed upon some corn which lay scattered about. He showed it to his companions, and told them that they ought to acquire by reading and philosophy such an apathy and unconcernedness in all accidents and dangers as they saw that poor creature naturally have. The opinion which is said to be Zeno's may deserve our consideration. He said that any one might give a guess at his proficiency from the observation of his dreams, if when asleep he fancied nothing that was immodest, nor seemed to consent to any wicked actions or dishonest intentions, but found his fancy and passions of his mind undisturbed, in a constant calm, as it were, always serene, and enlightened with the beams of divine reason. This very notion was hinted by Plato, as I interpret his words, where he is describing and delineating the soul which is tyrannical in its nature, and showing what manner of operations its fantasy and irrational appetite exert. When a man is asleep, he says, a vicious person designs the satisfying insensuous lust, has a longing for all sorts of meat indifferently, whether allowed or prohibited, and satisfies his appetite and desire in all manner of intemperance which is loose and unregarded, which, in the daytime, either the laws shame him out of, or fear to offend restrains. As now those brute beasts that are accustomed to labour will not, if the reins be let loose, either turn aside or offer to leave the track or stumble in it. So it is with the brutal faculty of the mind. When it is once made tame and manageable by the strength of reason, then it is unwilling carelessly to transgress or saucily to disobey its sovereign's commands, or to comply with any inordinate lusts, either in sleep or sickness. But it carefully observes and maintains its dictates to which it is accustomed, and by frequent exercise advances to perfect strength and intention of virtue. We find even in our own nature the strange effects of custom. Man is naturally able, by much exercise and the use of a stoical apathy, to bring the body and all its members into subjection, so that not one organ shall perform its operations. The eyes shall not burst out with tears upon the sight of a lamentable object. The heart shall not palpitate upon the apprehension of fear, and the passions shall not be roused at the sight of any beautiful person, whether man or woman. Now it is much more probable that the faculties of the sense may be so brought in subjection by undergoing such exercise as we speak of, that all its imaginations and motions may be smoothed and made agreeable to right reason, even when we are asleep and keep not sentry. It is reported of Stilpo, the philosopher, that he thought he saw Neptune in his sleep, and that he seemed very much displeased with him, because he had not, as was usual with his priests, sacrificed an ox in honour of him. Not in the least daunted at the apparition, he thus boldly accosted it. "Neptune, what's this business you here complain of? You come hither like a child and are angry with me, because I did not borrow money and run in debt to please you, and fill the city with costly odours, but privately sacrificed to you in my own house such ordinary victims as I could get." At this confident reply, Neptune smiled, and, as the story goes, reached him his hand as an assurance of his good will to him, and told him that for his sake he would send the Megarians abundance of fish that season. In the main, we may conclude thus much, that those that have clear and pleasant dreams, and are not troubled with any fright, strange, vicious, or irregular apparitions in their sleep, may assure themselves that they have some indications and dawnings of proficiency, whereas on the contrary, those dreams which are mixed with any pain, fear, cowardly aversions from good, childish exultation, or silly grief, so that they are both frightful and unaccountable, are like the breaking waves or the billows of the sea. For the soul, not having attained a perfect evenness of temper, but being under the formation of laws and precepts, from whose guidance and discovery it is free in time of sleep, is then slackened from its usual intenseness, and laid open to all passions whatever. Whether this temper we speak of be an argument or proficiency, or an indication of some other habit which has taken deep root in the soul, grown strong and immovable by all the power of reason, I leave to you to consider and determine. Seeing then an absolute apathy or freedom from all passions whatsoever is a great and divine perfection, and withal, considering that progress seems to consist in a certain remission and moderation of those very passions we carry about us, it unavoidably follows that if we will observe our passions with relation to one another and also to themselves, we may easily find out their differences. For example, first, we may observe from the passions compared with themselves whether our desires be now more moderate than they used to be, fear and anger less and more calm, and whether or not we are more able to quench the heat and flame of our passions than we used to be. Secondly, by comparing them with one another, we may observe whether we now have a greater share of shame than of fear, whether emulation be without any mixture of envy, whether we have greater desire of glory than of riches, whether we offend, as the musicians term it, in the Dorian or basal, or in the Lydian or treble notes, that is, whether we are more inured to abstinence and hardship than otherwise, whether we are unwilling rather than forward to appear in public, and lastly, whether we are undue admirers of the persons or performances of others, or despisers both of them and what they can do. As it is a good sign of recovery of a sick person in the distemper lie in the less principal parts of the body, so in proficiency, if vicious habits be changed into more tolerable passions, it is a symptom that they are going off and ready to be quenched. Phrynis, the musician, to his 7 strings added 2 more, was asked by the magistrates whether he had rather they should cut the upper or lower of them, the bass or treble. Now it is our business to cut off, as it were, both what is above and below, if we would attain to the true medium and equality. For proficiency, in the first place, remits the excess, and sweetens the harmony of the evil affections, which is, according to Sophocles, the madman's greatest pleasure and disease. We have already said that we ought to transfer our judgment to action, and not to suffer our words to remain bare and naked words, but to reduce them to deeds, and that this is the chiefest sign of a proficient. Now another manifest indication is a desire of those things we commend, and a readiness to perform those things which we admire, but whatsoever we discommend, neither to will or endure it. It is probable that all the Athenians highly extolled the courage and valour of Miltiades, but Themistocles, who professed that the trophies of Miltiades broke his sleep and often forced him out of his bed, did not only praise and admire what he had done, but was manifestly struck with a zeal and emulation of his performances. Therefore we may be assured that we have profited little, while we think it a vanity to admire those that have done well, and cannot possibly be raised to an imitation of them. To love the person of any man is not sufficient, except it have a mixture of emulation. No more is that love of virtue ardent and exciting, which does not put us forward, and create in our breasts, instead of envy to them, a zealous affection for all good men, and a desire of equal perfection with them. For it is not enough, as Alcibiades was wont to say, that the heart should be turned upside down by hearing the discourses of a philosopher, and that the tears should gush from the eyes, but he that is a proficient indeed, comparing himself with the designs and actions of a good perfect man, is pricked at the same with the consciousness of his own weakness, and transported with hope and desire, and big with irresistible assurance. And indeed such a one is, as Simonides says, like a little suckling foal running by the mother's side, and desires to be incorporated into the very same nature with a good man. For this is an especial sign of true proficiency, to love and affect their way of life, whose actions we emulate, and, upon account of an honourable opinion we always entertain for them, to do as they do. But whosoever he is that entertains a contentious or malicious design against his betters, let him be assured that he is possessed with a greedy desire of honour or greatness, but has neither a true respect nor admiration for virtue. When therefore we once begin so to love good men, as not only, according to Plato, to esteem the wise man himself happy, and him who hears his discourses sharer in his felicity, but also to admire and love his habit, gait, look, and very smile, so as to wish ourselves to be that very person, then we may be assured that we have made very good proficiency. This assurance will be advanced if we do not only admire good men in prosperity, but, like lovers who are taken ever with the lisping and pale looks of their mistresses, as Araspes is said to have been smitten with the tears and dejected looks of a mournful and afflicted Panthea, have an affection for virtue in its most mournful dress, so as not at all to dread the banishment of Aristides, the imprisonment of Anaxagoras, the poverty of Socrates, nor the hard fate of Phocion, but to embrace and respect their virtues, even under such injustice, and upon thoughts of it, to repeat this verse of Euripides: How do all fortunes decently become a generous, well-tuned soul? This is certain, if any one addresses himself to virtue with this resolution, not to be dejected at the appearance of difficulty, but heartily admires and prosecutes its divine perfection, none of the evil we have spoken of can divert his good intentions. To what I have said, I may add this, that when we go upon any business, undertake any office, or chance upon any affair whatever, we must set before our eyes some excellent person, either alive or dead, and consider with ourselves what Plato for the purpose would have done in this affair, what Epaminondas would have said, what Lycurgus or Agesilaus would have behaved themselves, that, addressing ourselves and adorning our minds at these mirrors, we may correct every disagreeing word and irregular passion. It is commonly said that those that have got by heart the names of the Idae Dactyli made use of them as charms to drive away fear, that they can but confidently repeat them one by one. So the consideration and remembrance of good men, being present and entertained in our minds, do preserve our proficiency in all affections and doubts regular and immovable. Whether you may judge that this is also a token of a proficient in virtue. You may observe further, that not to be in a confusion, not to blush, not to hide or correct your clothes, or anything about you, at the unexpected appearance of an honourable and wise person, but to have an assurance as if you were often conversant with such, is almost a perfect demonstration of a very intelligent person. It is reported of Alexander that one night, seeing a messenger joyfully running towards him and stretching out his hand, as if he had something to deliver to him, he said to the apparition, "Friend, what news do you bring me? Is Homer risen from the dead?" That admirable monarch thought that nothing was wanting to his great exploits, but such a herald as Homer. Consider this. If a young man thrive in the world, it is customary for him to desire nothing more than to be seen in the company of virtuous and good men, to show them his whole furniture, his table, his wife and children, his study, his diary or collections, and he is so pleased with himself that he wishes his father or tutor were alive, that they might see him in so good a way of living, and he could heartily pray that they were alive, to be spectators of his life and actions. But, on the contrary, those that have neglected their business, or lost themselves in the world, cannot endure the sight or company of their relations without a great deal of fear and confusion. Join this, if you please, to what we said before, for it is no small sign, if the proficient thus esteem every little fault a great one, and studiously observe and avoid all, for, as those persons who despair of ever being rich make little account of small expenses, thinking that little added to a little will never make any great sum, but when they come once to have got a competency, and hope to be at last very rich, it advances their desires. So it happens in the affairs of virtue. He that does not quiet his mind by saying with himself, "What matters it what comes after? If for the present it be so and so, yet better days will come." But who attends everything, and is not careless if the least vice pass uncondemned, but is troubled and concerned at it, such a one makes it appear that he has attained something that is pure, which he brightens by use and will not suffer to corrupt. For a preconceived opinion that nothing we have is valuable, according to Aeschylus, makes us careless and indifferent about everything. If any one be to make a dry wall or an ordinary hedge, it matters not much if he makes use of ordinary wood, or common stone, any old gravestones, or the like. So wicked persons, who confusedly mix and blend all their designs and actions in one heap, care not what materials they put together. But the proficients in virtue, who have already laid the golden solid foundation of a virtuous life, as of a sacred and royal building, take especial care of the whole work, examine and model every part of it according to the rule of reason, believing that it was well said by Polycletus, that the hardest work remained for them to do whose nails must touch the clay. That is, to lay the top stone is the great business and masterpiece of the work. The last stroke gives beauty and perfection to the whole piece. End of section 34. Recording by Luke Sartor, Griffith, New South Wales. Section 35 of The Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands. Corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Of Fortune. Mortals' affairs fortune, not counsel, rules. And does not justice rule the affairs of mortals, nor impartiality, nor moderation, nor decorum? But was it of fortune, and long of fortune, that Aristides remained obstinate in his poverty, although he could have made himself master of much wealth, and that Scipio, when he had taken Carthage, neither received nor so much as saw any part of the booty? Was it of fortune, and long of fortune, that Philocrates, having received a sum of gold of King Philip, laid it out in halls and fish, and that Laesthenes and Euthicrates, by measuring their happiness by their bellies in the most abject of follies, lost Olynthus? Was it of fortune that Alexander, son of Philip, refrained from the captive women himself, and punished those that offered them any indignity, while Alexander, son of Priam, long of an evil demon and fortune, first vitiated his host's wife, and then took her away with him, and filled both the continents with war and calamities? And if such things as these can come by fortune, what hinders but that we may as well plead that cats, goats, and monkeys are constrained by fortune to be ravenous, lustful, and ridiculous? But if there be such things to be found as moderation, justice, and fortitude, how can it stand with reason there should not be such a thing as wisdom also? And if there be wisdom, how can it be but there must be good counsel? For moderation is, as they are used to say, a certain sort of wisdom, and justice cannot subsist without wisdom. Certainly we call that good counsel and wisdom that render us manful in pleasures, continence, and moderation, in dangers and hardships, endurance and resolution, and in communities and public business, equality and justice. And therefore, if we will needs have it that the effects of conduct belong to fortune, let then both the effects of justice and moderation belong to fortune also. Nay, by Jove, let stealing be ascribed to fortune too, and cutting of purses, and a lustful lewd life, and let us quit our reason in quiet, and turn ourselves loose to fortune, to be carried and driven, like filth and dust, before an impetuous wind. If there be no such thing as conduct, it must of necessity follow that there should be no such thing as advising about our affairs, nor any consultation or inquiry about utility, and that Sophocles did talk idly when he said, "Whatever is sought, it may be caught, but what we shun will from us run." And when elsewhere he made this distribution of things, "I learn what's to be taught, I seek what's to be sought, I beg the rest of heaven." For what is to be sought, or what is to be learned by mortals, if all things go by fortune? And what senate of a republic is not overthrown, or what council of a prince is not dissolved, if all things are subject to fortune, which we use to upbraid with blindness, because we blindly fall into it? And indeed, how can we otherwise choose when we first pluck good counsel, like our eyes, out of our heads, and then take us a blind guide of our lives? Imagine that now some one of us should say, "Seas affairs fortune, not eyesight rules," nor yet the eyes, which Plato calls light-bearers, and again, "Here's affairs are by blind fortune ruled," and not by a certain power receptive of the strokes of the air, conveyed to it through the organ of the ear and brain. It would beseem us then, doubtless, to pay a due respect to our sense. But our sight, hearing, and smelling, with the other parts of our body's faculties, were bestowed upon us by nature to minister unto good conduct and discretion. And it is the mind that sees, and the mind that hears, the rest are deaf and blind. And as, were there not a sun, we might, for all the other stars, pass our days in darkness, as Heraclitus says, so had man neither mind nor reason. His life would be, for all his senses, nothing better than that of brutes. But it is by neither fortune nor chance that we exceed them and bear sway over them, but Prometheus, that is, reason, is the cause, which gives both horse and ass and oxen strong, to carry us and ease our labour long. As Aeschylus speaks, for the greater part of brutes are much happier than we, as to the fortune and form of their constitution, for some of them are armed with horns, some with teeth, and some with stings. And the urchin's back, saith Empedocles, bristles with prickly thorns. Others again are shod, others are clad with scales, others with shaggy hair, and others with hard claws and hoofs. But man alone, as Plato speaks, was left by nature naked, unarmed, unshod, and uncovered. But all those ills she sweetened with one gift, reason, care, and forecast. Small is the strength of poor frail man, yet by his shifting wit he can enslave the arts and properties of all on land, in sea, and skies. The lightest and swiftest things are horses, but they run for man. A dog is a fierce and an angry animal, but it guards man. Fish is the sweetest thing, and swine the fattest, but they are man's nourishment and cheer. What is bigger than an elephant? But this also is becoming man's plaything, and a spectacle of public solemnities, and it learns to skip, dance, and kneel. Such things as these are not introduced in vain, but that we may learn by them whither knowledge advances man, and above what things it sets him, and how it comes to be master, and exceed all other things. For we nor boxers nor good wrestlers are, nor yet good runners. Yet in all these we are far more unhappy than the brutes. But by our experience, memory, wit, and dexterity, as Anaxagoras speaks, we may use of what is theirs. We press out their honey, we milk them, we catch them, and drive them up and down as we please. So that in all this there is nothing that depends on fortune, but all on counsel and forecast. Moreover, the affairs of carpenters are affairs of mortals, and so are those of copper founders, builders, and statuaries, amongst whom yet we can see nothing brought to perfection by chance or at random. For that there falls in but little of fortune to an expert artist, whether founder or builder, but that the most and greatest part of their workmanship is performed by mere art, hath been thus insinuated by a certain poet. Go forth into the street, ye craftsmen all, who on grim-visaged Ergana do call, that stuck with sacred baskets all around. For the trades have Ergana and Minerva for their patroness, and not Fortune. It is indeed reported of one that, as he was drawing a horse, and had hit right in all the rest, both shapes and colours, but was not well satisfied with the draught he had made of a puff of froth that was tempered by the bit and wrought out with the horse's breathing, he therefore had often wiped it off, but that at length he in a great fume struck his sponge full of colours, as it was, against the board, and that this, as it lighted, to admiration, made a most lively impress, and so filled up what was defective in the piece. This is the only artificial work of Fortune that history mentions. Artists everywhere make use of rules, lines, measures, and arithmetical proportions, that their works may nowhere have in them anything that is casual or fortuitous. And the truth is, arts are styled a sort of petty wisdoms, though they might be much better called certain sheddings or filings of it sprinkled upon the several needful services of human life, as is obscurely riddled to us in the fire feigned to have been divided by Prometheus, and then scattered up and down the world. For just so, certain little particles and fragments of wisdom, as it were, crumbled and broken small, fell into ranks and methods. It seems therefore very strange how it came to pass that arts should stand in no need of Fortune to compass their proper end. But that which is the greatest and most complete of all arts, and which is the very sum of man's worth and commendation, should prove to be nothing at all. But there is a kind of good counsel in stretching and slackening of strings, which they call the art of music, and in dressing of meats, which we call cookery, and in washing of clothes, which we call the art of fulling. And we teach our children how to put on their shoes and clothes, and to take their meat in their right hand, and hold their bread in their left, as being sensible that even such common things as these do not come by Fortune, but require attention and heed. But do the greatest things, and the most important to a happy state, require no wisdom, and have no share in rational proceeding and forecast? Yet no man ever wetted clay, and then left it, as if there would be bricks by chance and Fortune, nor, having provided wool and leather, sat him down and prayed to Fortune, that they might be made clothes and shoes for him. Nor can any man, when he hath amassed together much gold and silver, and furnished himself with a multitude of slaves and attendants, and enclosed himself in a great palace with many gates, and set out costly couches and tables, fancy to himself that, if he have not wisdom with them, these things will be his happiness, and an undisturbed, blissful, and unchangeable life. One asked Iphicrates the general, by way of taunt, what he was. For he was neither spearman nor archer, nor yet bore light armour. I am, replied he, one that commands and uses all these. In like manner, wisdom is itself neither gold, nor silver, nor fame, nor wealth, nor health, nor strength, nor beauty. What then is it? Is it what can use all these with decorum, and by means of which every one of these is made pleasant, commendable, and useful, and without which they become useless, unprofitable, and prejudicial, and the burthen and shame of their possessors? Hesiod's Prometheus therefore gives very good advice to Epimetheus. Brother, be sure you never take a boon from Jove, but give't him back, meaning things of fortune and external. For, as if he had bid him not to play on a flute if ignorant of music, nor to read a book if he knew not his letters, nor to ride if he understood not a horse, So it would be if he advised him not to govern if a fool, nor to be a rich man if a miser, and not to marry if apt to be ruled by a woman. For success above desert is to fools an occasion of misthinking, as Demosthenes saith, yes, and good fortune above desert is to the unwise an occasion of misdoing. End of section 35. Recording by Luke Sartor, Griffith, New South Wales. Section 36 of The Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands. Corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Of Virtue and Vice. It is apparent that clothes make a man warm, not by warming him themselves, or by imparting heat to him, for every garment is of itself cold, which is the reason that we see those that are very hot and in a fever often shifting and changing one thing for another. But what heat a man exhales out of himself, that the garment lying close to his body keeps together and contracts, and when it hath driven it inward, it will not suffer it again to dissipate. This being the very case of external affairs too. It is this that cheats vulgar heads, by making them think that, if they might but enclose themselves in great houses, and heap together abundance of slaves and riches, they might then live to their own minds. But an agreeable and gay life is not to be found without us. On the contrary, it is man that out of his own temper, as out of a spring, adds pleasure and gaiety to the things about him. The house looks merrier when the fire burns. And wealth is the more agreeable, and fame and power the more resplendent, when they have the joy of the mind to accompany them. Since we see how that through a mild and tame disposition men can bear poverty, banishment, and old age easily and sweetly. For as odours perfume threadbare coats and poor rags, while Prince Anchises' ulcer sent forth a loathsome purulence, when the foul tent dripped on his purple robe, even so every state and condition of life, if accompanied with virtue, is undisturbed and delightful. But when vice is intermixed, it renders even the things that appear splendid, sumptuous, and magnificent, most distasteful, nauseous, and unacceptable to the possessors. This man's thought happy in the marketplace, but when he opens his doors, hell is his case. The woman governs all, commands and brawls. Though one may without any great difficulty get rid of a wicked, cross-grained wife, if he be but a man and not a slave. But a man cannot write a bill of divorce to his vice, and thereby free himself from further trouble, and procure his own repose by living apart. But it still cohabits with him, and dwells in his very bowels, and cleaves to him both by night and by day. It burns without a torch and hastens crude old age, being through its vain glory a burthensome fellow traveller, and through its voracity a chargeable table companion, and a troublesome bedfellow by breaking and spoiling one's sleep night with cares, anxieties, and surmises. For when he does sleep, his body is indeed at rest and quiet, but his mind is, through superstition, in terrors, dreams, and frights. When in my slumbers sorrows fill me, then frightful dreams and visions kill me, saith one. Just thus envy, fear, anger, and lust affect us. For by daytime our vice, by looking abroad and fashioning herself to the manner of others, grows shamefaced, and finds herself obliged to mask her own disorders, and does not yield herself up wholly to her appetites, but oftentimes resists and struggles with them. But in times of sleep, when it escapes both the opinions of men and the laws, and is at the remotest distance from awe and respect, it stirs every desire, and raises up its malignity and lewdness. For it attempts, as Plato speaks, the embraces of a mother. It purveys unlawful meats, and refrains from no sort of action, enjoying villainy as far as it is practicable, in shades and phantoms that end in no real pleasure or accomplishment of desire, but have only power to stir up and enrage disorders and distempers. Where then is the pleasure of vice, if there be nowhere to be found either freedom from care, or exemption from trouble, or satisfaction, or undisturbedness, or repose? A sound complexion and good health of body give indeed both place and birth to the flesh's pleasures, but there cannot be engendered a gaiety and cheerfulness in the mind, unless undauntedness, assurance, or an immovable serenity be the foundation. Nay, if some hope or satisfaction should simper a little, this would be soon puddled and disturbed by some sudden eruption of care, like a smooth sea by a rock. Heap up gold, gather together silver, raise up walks, fill your house with slaves and the town with debtors. If you do not appease the disorders of your own mind, and stint your unsatiable desire, and deliver yourself from fears and cares, you do but rack wine for a man in a fever, and administer honey to a man disturbed with bile, and prepare meat and good cheer for people that have the flux or gripes, who can neither retain it nor be strengthened by it, but are over and above spoilt by it. Do you not see how sick persons loathe, spit out and refuse the finest and most costly meats, though they be proffered and forced upon them? And how again, when their complexion alters, and good spirits, sweet blood, and a connatural heat are engendered, they get up and gladly and willingly eat brown bread, cheese, and cresses? Such a disposition as this is it that reason works in the mind. And you will have sufficiency, if you will but learn what a notable and generous mind is. You will live luxuriously in poverty, and be a prince, and you will be as much in love with a vacant and private life as with that of a general or king. If you once apply to philosophy, you will never live without pleasure, but you will learn to be everywhere pleased, and with everything. You will be pleased with wealth for making you beneficial to many, and with poverty for not having much to care for, with fame for being honoured, and with obscurity for being unenvied. End of section 36. Recording by Luke Sartor, Griffith, New South Wales.
Section 37 of the Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch. Translated by several hands, corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Conjugal Precepts, Part 1. Plutarch to Pollianus and Eurydice sendeth greeting. Now that the nuptial ceremonies are over, and the priestess of Ceres has joined you both together in the bands of matrimony according to the custom of the country, I thought a short discourse of this nature might not be either unacceptable or unseasonable, but rather serve as a kind epithalamium to congratulate your happy conjunction, more especially since there can be nothing more useful in conjugal society than the observance of wise and wholesome precepts suitable to the harmony of matrimonial converse. For among the variety of musical moods and measures there is one which is called hippothoros, a sort of composition to the flute and hautboy, made use to encourage and provoke stallions to cover mares. But philosophy being furnished with many noble and profitable discourses, there is not any one subject that deserves a more serious study than that of wedlock, whereby they who are engaged in a long community of bed and board are more steadfastly united in affection, and made more pliable one to another in humor and condition. To this purpose, having reduced under several short heads and similes some certain instructions and admonitions, which you, as tutored up in philosophy, have frequently already heard, I send you the collection as a present, beseeching the Muses so with their presence to assist the goddess Venus, that the harmony of your mutual society and complacency in domestic diligences may outcry the melodious concords of lute and harp, while you live united together by reason and philosophy. Therefore it was that the ancients placed the statue of Venus by that of Mercury, to signify that the pleasures of matrimony chiefly consist in the sweetness of conversation. They also set the Graces and the Sodella, the goddess of eloquence, together, to show that the married couple were not to act only by persuasion, and not to use the violences of wrangling and contention. 1. Solon advises that the bride should eat a quince before she entered the nuptial sheets, intimating thereby, in my opinion, that the man was to expect his first pleasures from the breath and speech of his new married bedfellow. 2. In Boeotia it is the custom, when they veil the virgin bride, to set upon her head a chaplet of wild asparagus, which from a thorny stalk affords a most delicious fruit, to let us understand that a new married man, discreetly brooking at the beginning the first distaste of marriage restraints, grows yieldingly complacent at length, and makes conforming wedlock a happiness to each. And indeed such husbands who cannot bear with the little disdains and first froppishness of imprudent youth are like to those that choose the sour grapes and leave to others the ripe delicious clusters. On the other side, those young ladies that take a disdain to their husbands by reason of their first debates and encounters may be well compared to those that patiently endure the sting but fling away the honey. 3. It especially behooves those people who are newly married to avoid the first occasions of discord and dissension, considering that vessels newly formed are subject to be bruised and put out of shape by many slight accidents. But when the materials come once to be settled and hardened by time, nor fire nor sword will hardly prejudice the solid substance. 4. Fire takes speedy hold of straw or hare's fur, but soon goes out again unless fed with an addition of more fuel. Thus that same love, whose flames are nourished only by heat of youth and looser charms of beauty, seldom proves of long continuance or grows to wedlock maturity, unless it have taken a deep root in conformity of manners, and mutual affection will be enlivened by the intermixture of souls as well as bodies, while prudence and discretion feed the noble flame. 5. They who bait their hooks with intoxicated drugs with little pains surprise the hungry fish, but then they prove unsavory to the taste and dangerous to eat. Thus women that by the force of charms and philters endeavor to subdue their husbands to the satisfaction of their pleasure become at length the wives of madmen, sots, and fools. For they whom the sorceress Circe had enchanted, being then no better than swine and asses, were no longer able to please or do her service. But she loved Ulysses entirely, whose prudence avoided her venomous intoxications and rendered his conversation highly grateful. 6. They who rather choose to be the mistress of senseless fools than the obedient wives of wise and sober husbands are like those people that prefer misguidance of the blind before the conduct of them that can see and know the way. 7. They will not believe that Pasiphae, the consort of a prince, could ever be enamored of a bull, and yet themselves are so extravagant as to abandon the society of their husbands, men of wisdom, temperance, and gravity, and betake themselves to the bestial embraces of those who are given wholly to riot and debauchery, as if they were dogs or goats. 8. Some men, either unable or unwilling to mount themselves into their saddles through infirmity or laziness, teach their horses to fall upon their knees, and in that posture to receive their riders. In like manner, there are some persons who, having married young ladies not less considerable for the nobility of their birth than their wealthy dowries, take little care themselves to improve the advantages of such a splendid conjunction, but with a severe moroseness labor to depress and degrade their wives, proud of the mastery and vaunting in domestic tyranny. Whereas in this case it becomes a man to use the reins of government with as equal regard to the quality and dignity of the woman as to the stature of the horse. 9. We behold the moon then shining with a full and glorious orb when farthest distant from the sun. But as she warps back again to meet her illustrious mate, the nearer she makes her approach, the more she is eclipsed until no longer seen. Quite otherwise, a woman ought to display the charms of her virtue and the sweetness of her disposition in her husband's presence, but in his absence to retire to silence and reservedness at home. 10. Nor can we approve the saying of Herodotus that a woman lays aside her modesty with her shift. For surely then it is that a chaste woman chiefly veils herself with bashfulness, when, in the privacies of matrimonial duties, excess of love and maiden reverence become the secret signals and testimonies of mutual affection. 11. As in musical concords, when the upper strings are so tuned as exactly to accord, the bass always gives the tone. So in well-regulated and well-ordered families, all things are carried on with the harmonious consent and agreement of both parties. But the conduct and contrivance chiefly redounds to the reputation and management of the husband. 12. It is a common proverb that the sun is too strong for the north wind. For the more the wind ruffles and strives to force a man's upper garment from his back, the faster he holds it, and the closer he wraps it about his shoulders. But he who so briskly defended himself from being plundered by the wind, when once the sun begins to scald the air, all in a dropping sweat, is then constrained to throw away not only his flowing garment, but his tunic also. This puts us in mind of the practice of most women, who, being limited by their husbands in their extravagance of feasting and superfluities of habit, presently fill the house with noise and uproar. Whereas, if they would but suffer themselves to be convinced by reason and soft persuasion, they would of themselves acknowledge their vanity and submit to moderation. 13. Cato ejected a certain Roman out of the Senate for kissing his wife in the presence of his daughter. It is true the punishment was somewhat too severe, but if kissing and calling and hugging in the sight of others be so unseemly, as indeed it is, how much more indecent is it to chide and bawl and maunder at one another while strangers are in company? If lawful familiarity and caresses between man and wife are not to be allowed but in their private retirements, shall the bitter interchanges and loud discoveries of invective and inconsiderate passion be thought an entertainment pleasingly proper for unconcerned and public ears? 14. As there is little or no use to be made of a mirror, though in a frame of gold enchased with all the sparkling variety of the richest gems, unless it render back the true similitude of the image it receives, so is there nothing of profit in a wealthy dowry, unless the conditions, the temper, the humor of the wife be conformable to the natural disposition and inclination of her husband, and he sees the virtue of his own mind exactly represented in hers. Or if a fair and beautiful mirror that makes a sad and pensive visage look jocund and gay, or a wanton or smiling countenance show pensive and mournful, is therefore presently rejected as of no value. Thus may not she be thought an angry, peevish, and importunate woman, that louts and lowers upon the caresses of a husband, and when he courts the pastime of her affections, entertains him with frumps and taunts, but when she finds him serious in business, allures him then with her unseasonable toyings to pleasure and enjoyment. For the one is an offence of impertinency, the other a contempt of her husband's kindness. But as geometricians affirm that lines and surfaces are not moved of themselves, but according to the motions of the bodies to which they belong, so it behooves a woman to challenge no peculiar passion or affection as her own, but to share with her husband in business, in his recreations, in his cares, and in his mirth. 15. As they who are offended to see their wives eat and drink freely in their company do but whet their appetites to glut and gourmandize in corners by themselves, so they who refuse to frolic in retirement with their wives, or to let them participate of their private pastimes and dalliances, do but instruct them to cater for their own pleasures and delights. 16. The Persian kings, when they contain themselves within the limits of their usual banquets, suffer their married wives to sit down at their tables. But when they once design to indulge in provocations of amorous heats and wine, then they send away their wives and call for their concubines, their gypsies, and their songstresses, with their lascivious tunes and wanton galliards, wherein they do dwell, not thinking it proper to debauch their wives with the tipsy frolics and dissolute extravagances of their intemperance. If, therefore, any private person, swayed by the unruling motions of his inconstancy, happen at any time to make a trip with a kind she-friend or his wife's chambermaid, it becomes not the wife presently to lower and take pepper in the nose, but rather to believe that it was his respect to her which made him unwilling she should behold the follies of ebriety and foul intemperance. 17. Princes that be addicted to music increase the number of excellent musicians. If they be lovers of learning, all men strive to excel in reading and in eloquence. If given to martial exercises, a military ardor rouses straight the drowsy sloth of all their subjects. Thus husbands, effeminately finical, only teach their wives to paint and polish themselves with borrowed luster. The studious of pleasure render them immodest and whorish. On the other side, men of serious, honest, and virtuous conversations make sober, chaste, and prudent wives. 18. A young Lacedaemonian lass, being asked by an acquaintance of hers whether she had yet embraced her husband, made no answer, no, but that he had embraced her. And after this manner, in my opinion, it behooves an honest woman to behave herself toward her husband, never to shun nor to disdain the caresses and dalliances of his amorous inclinations, when he himself begins, but never herself to offer the first occasion of provocation. For the one savours of impudent harlotry, the other displays a female pride and imperiousness void of conjugal affection. 19. It behooves a woman not to make peculiar and private friendships of her own, but to esteem only her husband's acquaintance and familiars as hers. Now, as the gods are our chiefest and most beneficial friends, it behooves her to worship and adore only those deities which her husband reputes and reverences for such. But as for quaint opinions and superstitious innovations, let them be exterminated from her outermost threshold. For no sacrifices or services can be acceptable to the gods, performed by women, as it were, by stealth and in secret, without the knowledge of the husband. 20. Plato asserts those cities to be the most happy and best regulated where these expressions, "this is mine," and "this is not mine," are seldomest made use of. For that then the citizens enjoy in common, so far as is convenient, those things that are of greatest importance. But in wedlock those expressions are utterly to be abolished. For as the physician says that the right side being bruised or beaten communicates its pain to the left side, so indeed the husband ought to sympathize in the sorrows and afflictions of the woman, and much more does it become the wife to be sensible of the miseries and calamities of the husband. to the intent that, as knots are made fast by knitting the bows of a thread one within another, so the ligaments of conjugal society may be strengthened by the mutual interchange of kindness and affection. This nature herself instructs us by mixing us in our bodies, while she takes a part from each, and then blending the whole together, produces a being common to both, to the end that neither may be able to discern or distinguish what was belonging to the other, or lay claim to assured propriety. Therefore is community of estate and purses chiefly requisite among married couples, whose principal aim it ought to be to mix and incorporate their purchases and disbursements into one substance, neither pretending to call this hers or that his, but accounting all inseparably peculiar to both. However, as in a goblet where the proportion of water exceeds the juice of the grape, yet still we call the mixture wine. In like manner, the house and estate must be reputed the possession of the husband, although the woman brought in the chiefest part. 21. Helen was covetous, Paris luxurious. On the other side, Ulysses was prudent, Penelope chaste. Happy therefore was the match between the latter. But the nuptials of the former brought an Iliad of miseries as well upon the Greeks as barbarians. 22. The question being put by some of his friends to a certain Roman, why he had put away his wife, both sober, beautiful, and chaste, and rich, the gentleman, putting forth his foot and showing his buskin, said, Is not this a new, handsome, complete shoe? Yet no man but myself knows where it pinches me. Therefore ought not a woman to boast either of her dower, her parentage, or beauty, but in such things as most delight a husband, pleasantness of converse, sweetness of disposition, and briskness of humor, there to show nothing of harshness, nothing distasteful, nothing offensive, but from day to day to study behavior, jocund, blithe, and conformable to his temper. For as physicians are much more afraid of fevers that proceed from hidden causes, which have been by little and little contracting for a long time together, than those that receive their nourishment from apparent and manifest unconcoctions. Thus, if daily continued, the petty snubs and frumps between man and wife, though perhaps unknown to others, are of that force that above all things else they canker conjugal affection, and destroy the pleasure of cohabitation. 22. King Philip so far doted on a fair Thalassian lady that she was suspected to have used some private arts of fascination towards him. Wherefore Olympias labored to get the supposed sorceress into her power. But when the queen had viewed her well, and duly examined her beauty, beheld the graces of her deportment, and considered her discourse, bespake her no less than a person of noble descent and education. Hence fond suspicions, hence vainer calumnies, said she, for I plainly find the charms which thou makest use of are in thyself. Certainly, therefore, a lawful wife surpasses the common acceptation of happiness, when without enhancing the advantages of her wealth, nobility, and form, or vaunting the possession of Venus Cestus in itself, she makes it her business to win her husband's affection by her virtue and sweetness of disposition. 24. Another time the same Olympias, understanding that a young courtier had married a lady beautiful indeed, but of no good report, said, Sure the Hotspur had little brains, otherwise he would never have married with his eyes. For they are fools who in the choice of a wife believe the report of their sight or fingers, like those who, telling out the portion in their thoughts, take the woman upon content, never examining what her conditions are, or whether she is proper to make him a fit wife or no. 25. Socrates was wont to give this advice to young men that accustomed themselves to their mirrors: if ill-favored, to correct their deformity by the practice of virtue; if handsome, not to blemish their outward form with inward vice. In like manner, it would not be amiss for a mistress of a family, when she holds her mirror in her hands, to discourse her own thoughts. If deformed thus, should I prove lewd and wicked too? On the other side, thus the fair one, what if chaste beside? For it adds a kind of veneration to a woman not so handsome, that she is more beloved for the perfections of her mind than the outside graces of her body. 26. Dionysius, the tyrant of Sicily, sent several costly presents of rich apparel, necklaces, and bracelets to the daughters of Lysander, which, however, the father would never permit the virgins to accept, saying, "These gaudy presents will procure more infamy than honor to my daughters." And indeed, before Lysander, Sophocles, in one of his tragedies, had uttered the following sentence to the same effect: "Mistake not, silly wretch, this pompous trim rather disgraces than proclaims thee great, and shows the rage of thy lascivious heat. For, as Crates said, that is ornament which adorns, and that adorns a woman which renders her more comely and decent. This is an honor conferred upon her, not by the luster of gold, the sparkling of emeralds and diamonds, nor splendor of the purple tincture, but by the real embellishments of gravity, discretion, humility, and modesty." 27. They who offer to Juno as the goddess of wedlock never consecrate the gall with the other parts of the sacrifice, but having drawn it forth, they cast it behind the altar, which constitution of the lawgiver fairly implies that all manner of passionate anger and bitterness of reproach should be exterminated from the thresholds of nuptial cohabitation. Not but that a certain kind of austerity becomes the mistress of a family, which however should be like that of wine, profitable and delightful, not like aloes, biting and medicinally ungrateful to the palate. End of section 37. Section 38 of the Morals, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Morals, Volume 2 by Plutarch, translated by several hands, corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin. Conjugal Precepts, Part 2. 28. Plato, observing the morose and sour humor of Xenocrates, otherwise a person of great virtue and worth, admonished him to sacrifice to the graces. In like manner, I am of opinion that it behooves a woman of moderation to crave the assistance of the graces in her behavior towards her husband, thereby, according to the saying of Metrodorus, to render their society mutually harmonious to each other, and to preserve her from being waspishly proud, out of a conceit of her fidelity and virtue. For it becomes not a frugal woman to be neglectful of decent neatness, nor one who has great respect to her husband to refrain complacency in her conversation. As the over-rigid humor of a wife renders her honesty irksome, so sluttery begets a hatred of her sparing and pinching housewifery. 29. She who is afraid to laugh or to appear merry and gay before her husband, for fear of waking his jealousy, may be so said to resemble one that forbears to anoint herself at all, lest she should be thought to use unnecessary or harlotry perfumes, or that neglects to wash her face to avoid the suspicion of painting. Thus we find that poets and orators, who desire to shun the tiring tediousness of a low, vulgar, and drowsy style, ingeniously labor to detain and move both their readers and their auditors by the quaintness of their invention, grandeur of the subject, and lively representations of the humors and conditions which they bring upon the stage. From whence a discreet mistress of a family may likewise learn to avoid all manner of over-nice curiosity and squeamish affectation, all excess of jollity savoring of the courtesan, and everything tending to profuse pomp. But she will rather employ all her wit and art in exhibiting to her husband all the graces of life and character, accustoming him to honesty and decency joined with pleasure and delight. Nevertheless, if there be any woman so severe and reserved by nature that no means can be found to make her blithe and sportive, it behooves her husband to give way to her temper. And as Phocion answered Antipater, who commanded him to do an ill thing that misbecame his quality, I cannot be thy friend, and flatter thee at one and the same time. In like manner ought a man to rest satisfied with the virtues of a chaste wife, though her serious disposition will not permit her to act the airy part of a mistress. 30. The Egyptian women were anciently never wont to wear shoes, to the end they might accustom themselves to stay at home. But altogether different is the humor of our women, for they, unless allowed their jewels, their bracelets and necklaces, their gaudy vestments, gowns, and petticoats, all bespangled with gold and their embroidered buskins, will never stir abroad. 31. Theano, as she was dressing herself one morning in her chamber, by chance discovered some part of her naked arm, upon which one of the company crying out, "Oh, what a lovely arm is there! 'Tis very true," said she, "but yet not common." Thus ought a chaste and virtuous woman not only to keep her naked arms from open view, but to lock up her very words and set a guard upon her lips, especially in the company of strangers, since there is nothing which sooner discovers the qualities and conditions of a woman than her discourse. 32. Phidias made the statue of Venus at Elis with one foot upon the shell of a tortoise, to signify two great duties of a virtuous woman, which are to keep at home and be silent. For she is only to speak to her husband, or by her husband, nor is she to take amiss the uttering her mind in that manner through another more proper organ. 33. Princes and kings honor themselves in giving honor to philosophers and learned men. On the other side, great personages, admired and courted by philosophers, are no way honored by their flatteries, which are rather a prejudice and stain to the reputation of those that use them. Thus it is with women, who in honoring and submitting to their husbands win for themselves honor and respect, but when they strive to get the mastery, they become a greater reproach to themselves than to those that are so ignominiously henpecked. But then again it behooves a husband to control his wife, not as a master does his vassal, but as the soul governs the body, with the gentle hand of mutual friendship and reciprocal affection. For as the soul commands the body without being subject to its pleasures and inordinate desires, in like manner should a man so exercise his authority over his wife as to soften it with complacence and kind requital of her loving submission. 34. Philosophers assert that of bodies which consist of several parts, some are composed of parts distinct and separate, as a navy or army royal, others of contiguous parts, as a house or a ship, and others of parts united at the first conception, equally partaking of life and motion, and growing together, as are the bodies of all living creatures. Thus, where people wed for pure affection, that marriage may be said to resemble those bodies whose parts are solidly fixed together. They who marry for the sake of great portions, or else desirous of offspring, are like to bodies whose parts are contiguous and cleave close to one another. And they who only bed together, if there be any such, resemble bodies whose parts are distinct without dependency. Now, as physicians say that liquids are the only bodies which most easily intermix without any difference of property or respect one with another, so should it be said of people joined together in matrimony, that there is a perfect mixture of bodies and estates, of friends and relations. Therefore the Roman law prohibits new married people from giving and receiving mutual presents one from another. Not that they should not participate one with another, but to show that they were not to enjoy anything but what they possess in common. 35. In Leptis, a city of Libya, it was an ancient custom for the bride, the next day after the nuptial solemnity, to send home to the mother of the bridegroom to borrow a boiler, which she not only refused to lend, but sent back word that she had none to spare, to the end that the new married woman, having by that means tried the disposition of her mother-in-law, if afterwards she found her humour peevish and perverse, might with more patience brook her unkindness, as being no more than what she expected. Rather it becomes the daughter to avoid all occasions of distaste. For it is natural to some mothers to be jealous that the wife deprives her of that filial tenderness which she expects from her son, for which there is no better cure than for a wife so to contrive with gaining of her husband's love as not to lessen or withdraw his affection from his mother. 36. It is generally observed that mothers are fondest of their sons, as expecting from them their future assistance when they grow into years, and that fathers are kindest to their daughters, as standing most in need of their paternal succor. And perhaps out of that mutual respect which the man and his wife bear one to another, either of them would seem to carry greater affection for that which is proper and familiar to the other. But this pleasing controversy is easily reconciled, for it becomes a woman to show the choicest of her respects, and to be more complacent to the kindred of her husband than to her own, to make her complaints to them, and conceal her discontents from her own relations. For the trust which she reposes in them causes them to confide in her, and her esteem of them increases their respects to her. 37. The commanders of the Grecian auxiliaries that marched in aid of Cyrus gave these instructions to their soldiers, that if their enemies advance whooping and hallowing to the combat, they should receive the charge, observing an exact silence. But on the other hand, if they came on silently, then to rend the air with their martial shouts. Thus prudent wives, when their husbands in the heat of their passion rant and tear the house down, should make no returns, but quietly hold their peace. But if they only frown out their discontents in moody anger, then with soft language and gently reasoning the case, they may endeavour to appease and qualify their fury. 38. Rightly, therefore, are they reprehended by Euripides, who introduced the harp and other instruments of music at their computations. For music ought rather to be made use of for the mitigation of wrath, and to allay the sorrows of mourning, not to heighten the voluptuousness of those that are already drowned in jollity and delight. Believe yourselves then to be in an error that sleep together for pleasure, but when angry and at variance make two beds, and that never at that time call to your assistance the goddess of Venus, who better than any other knows how to apply a proper remedy to such distempers, as Homer teaches us, where he brings in Juno using this expression: "Your deadly feuds will I myself appease, and the amorous bed shall be the charming place, where all your strife shall embracing cease." 39. Though it becomes a man and his wife at all times to avoid all occasions of quarrelling one with another, yet is there no time so unseasonable for contention as when they are between the same sheets. As the woman in difficult labour said to those that were about to lay her upon her bed, "How," said she, "can this bed cure these pains, since it was in this very bed that my pleasures were the cause of all my throes? And still less will those reproaches and contests which the bed produces be reconciled at any other time or place." 40. Hermione seems to be in the right, speaking to this effect in one of the tragedies of Euripides: "The lewd discourse of women void of shame ruined my honour and my virtuous name." However, these mischiefs rarely happen but where women at variance and jealous of their husbands open not only their door but their ears to hold swarms of twattling gossips that widen the difference. For then it behooves a prudent woman to shut her ears and beware of listening to such enchanting tattlers, calling to mind the answers of Philip, when he was exasperated by his friends against the Greeks for cursing and reviling him, notwithstanding all the benefits they had received at his hands. What would they have done, said he, had we used them with unkindness and severity? The same should be the reply of a prudent woman to those she-devils, when they shall bewail her condition and cry, a woman so loving, so chaste and modest, and yet abused by her husband. For then should she make answer, what would he do, should I begin to hate him and do him wrong? 41. A certain master, whose slave had been run away from him for several months together, after a long search at length found him suddenly in a workhouse, and said, where could I have desired to meet with thee more to my wish than in such a place as this? Thus, when a woman is grown jealous of her husband, and meditates nothing but present divorce, before she be hasty, let her reason with herself in this manner: in what condition would my rival choose to see me with greater satisfaction than as I am, all in a fret and fume, enraged against my husband, and ready to abandon both my house and marriage bed together? 42. The Athenians yearly solemnize 3 sacred seed times. The first is Jairus, in memory of the first invention by their ancestors of plowing and sowing. The second at a place called Moralia. And the third under Pallas, which they call Buxugion, in commemoration of the first spanning of oxen to the plow. But more sacred than all these is the nuptial plowing and sowing, in order to the procreation of children. And therefore Sophocles rightly calls Venus the fruitful Cytherea, for which reason it highly imports both the man and the woman, when bound together by the holy tie of wedlock, to abstain from all unlawful and forbidden copulation, and from plowing and sowing where they never desire to reap any fruit of their labor, or if the harvest come to perfection, they conceal and are ashamed to own it. 43. The orator Gorgias, in a full assembly of the Grecians, resorting from all parts to the Olympic games, making an oration to the people, wherein he exhorted them to live in peace, unity, and concord among one another, Melanthus cried out aloud, this man pretends to give us advice, and preaches here in public nothing but love and union, who in his own private family is not able to keep his wife and his maid from being continually together by the ears. Yet there are only they 3 in the house. For it seems that Gorgias had a kindness for his servant, which made her mistress jealous. And therefore it behooves that man to have his family in exquisite order who will undertake to regulate the failing of his friends, or the public miscarriages, especially since the misbehavior of men toward their wives is far sooner divulged among the people than the transgressions of the woman against the husbands. 44. It is reported that the scent of sweet perfumes will make a cat grow mad. Now, supposing those strong perfumes, which are used by many men, should prove offensive to their wives, would it not be a great piece of unnatural kindness to discompose a woman with continual fits, rather than deny himself a pleasure so trivial? But when it is not their husbands perfuming themselves, but their lascivious wandering after lewd and extravagant women, that disturbs and disorders their wives, it is a great piece of injustice, for the tickling pleasure of a few minutes, to afflict and disquiet a virtuous woman. For since they who are conversant with bees will often abstain from women, to prevent the persecution of those little but implacable enemies of unclean dalliance, much rather ought a man to be pure from the pollutions of harlotry when he approaches his chaste and lawful wife. 45. They whose business it is to manage elephants never put on white frocks, nor dare they that govern wild bulls appear in red, those creatures being scared and exasperated by those colors. And some report that tigers, when they hear a drum beat afar off, grow mad and exercise their savage fury upon themselves. If then there are some men that are offended at the gay and sumptuous habit of their wives, and others that brook as ill their gadding to plays and balls, what reason is there that women should not refrain those vanities, rather than perplex and discontent their husbands, with whom it becomes their modesty to live with patience and sobriety? 46. What said a woman to King Philip, that pulled and hauled her to him by violence against her will? Let me go, she said, for when the candles are out, all women are alike. This is aptly applied to men addicted to adultery and lust. But a virtuous wife, when the candle is taken away, ought then chiefly to differ from all other women. For when her body is not to be seen, her chastity, her modesty, and her peculiar affection to her husband ought then to shine with their brightest luster. 47. Plato admonishes old men to carry themselves with most gravity in the presence of young people, to the end the awe of their example may imprint in youth the greater respect and reverence of age. For the loose and vain behavior of men stricken in years breeds a contempt of gray hairs, and never can expect veneration from juvenility, which sober admonition should instruct the husband to bear a greater respect to his wife than to all other women in the world, seeing that the nuptial chamber must be to her either the school of honor and chastity, or that of inconstancy and wantonness. For he that allows himself those pleasures that he forbids his wife acts like a man that would enjoin his wife to oppose those enemies to which he has himself already surrendered. 48. As to what remains in reference to superfluity of habit and decent household furniture, remember, dear Eurydice, what Timoxenas has written to Aristilla. And do you, Pollianus, never believe that women will be weaned from those toys and curiosities wherein they take a kind of pride, and which serve for an alleviation of their domestic solitude, while you yourself admire the same things in other women, and are taken with the gaiety of golden beakers, magnificent pictures for your houses, and rich trappings for your mules and horses? For it were a strange moroseness to debar a woman those ornamental vanities which naturally her sex admire, nor will it easily be endured without regret, where she sees the man much more indulgent to his own humor. Since then thou art arrived at those years which are proper for the study of such sciences as are attained by reason and demonstration, endeavor to complete this knowledge by conversing with persons that may be serviceable to thee in such a generous design. And as for thy wife, like the industrious bee, gather everywhere from the fragrant flowers of good instruction, replenish thyself with whatever may be of advantage to her, and impart the same to her again in loving and familiar discourse, both for thy own and her improvement. For father thou and mother art to her, she now is thine, and not the parent's care. Nor is it less to thy commendation to hear what she returns. And you, my honored husband, are my guide, and tutor in philosophy beside, from whose instructions I at once improve the fruits of knowledge and the sweets of love. For such studies as these fix the contemplations of women upon what is laudable and serious, and prevent their wasting time upon impertinent and pernicious vanity. For that lady that is studious in geometry will never affect the dissolute motions of dancing, and she that is taken with the sublime notions of Plato and Xenophon will look with disdain upon the charms and enchantments of witches and sorcerers. And if any ridiculous astrologer promises to pull the moon down from the sky, she will laugh at the ignorance and folly of women who believe in him, being herself well grounded in astronomy, and having heard about Aganice, the daughter of Hegetor, a Thessalian lord, who, understanding the reason of the eclipses of the moon, and knowing beforehand the time of her being obscured by the shadow of the earth, made the credulous women believe that it was she who at those times unhinged the moon and removed her from the sky. True it is that never any woman brought forth a perfect child without the assistance and society of man, but there are many whose imaginations are so strongly wrought upon by the sight or bare relation of monstrous spectacles that they bring into the world several sorts of immature and shapeless productions. Thus, unless great care be taken by men to manure and cultivate the inclinations of their wives with wholesome and virtuous precepts, they often breed among themselves the false conceptions of extravagant and loose desires. But do thou, Eurydice, make it thy business to be familiar with the learned proverbs of wise and learned men, and always to embellish thy discourse with their profitable sentences, to the end thou mayest be the admiration of other women, that shall behold thee so richly adorned without the expense or assistance of jewels and embroideries. For pearls and diamonds are not the purchase of an ordinary purse, but the ornaments of Theano, Cleobulini, Gorgo, the wife of King Leonidas, Timoclea, the sister of Theagenes, the ancient Roman Claudia, or Cornelia, the daughter of Scipio, already so celebrated and renowned for their virtues, will cost but little, yet nothing will set thee out more glorious or illustrious to the world, or render thy life more comfortable and happy. For as Sappho, only because she could compose an elegant verse, had the confidence to write to a haughty and wealthy dame in her time, dead thou shalt lie forgotten in thy tomb, since not for thee Pierian roses bloom. Why may it not be much more lawful for thee to boast those great perfections that give thee a greater privilege, not only to gather the flowers, but to reap the fruits themselves, which the Muses bestow upon the lovers and real owners of learning and philosophy? End of section 38. End of the Morals, Volume 2, by Plutarch, translated by several hands, corrected and revised by William W. Goodwin.